The fork touched the plate with a sound so small it should not have mattered. But in that dining room, where the walls were thick with oil paintings and the chandelier threw cold light over a table long enough to seat 20, every small sound was the only sound. Ilara sat at one end. Her husband, the Duke of Harwick, sat at the other. Between them were silver candle holders, a flower arrangement that had been perfect 3 days ago and was now beginning to lose its first petals, and 6 feet of polished mahogany that felt in that moment like 6 miles. She had been watching her soup cool. The soup was cream-based, with a fine swirl of herb oil on top, arranged by the kitchen staff with the kind of care that went unnoticed every evening in this house. Ilara had noticed it. She always noticed, but she had not lifted the spoon because lifting the spoon would mean looking down, and looking down meant the Duke would think she was comfortable, and she was not comfortable. She was very much the opposite of comfortable. She was sitting in a chair with a straight back and a cushioned seat, and she felt as though she were perched on the edge of something very high. The Duke's name was Edmund. Edmund Harwick, the 5th Duke of Harwick, owner of 3 estates, and a name that appeared in the history books of this country in connection with battles and royal favors and land grants signed by kings long dead. He was 41 years old, and he had the kind of face that people described as distinguished rather than handsome, the kind of face that looked best in portraits and worst in candlelight when it was expressionless, which it almost always was. He had not looked at her since they sat down. Ilara had been married to him for 4 months. 4 months was not a long time, she knew that. She had told herself that many times. People who had been married for 40 years sometimes still did not fully know each other, so 4 months was practically the beginning. She had told herself to be patient. She had told herself that marriages built on arrangements took time to warm. Her mother had told her this. Her aunt had told her this. 3 different women she respected had sat across from her at various points in the 2 months before the wedding, and said, with the particular confidence of women who had survived their own difficult beginnings, that things would settle. She had believed them. She was no longer sure she believed them. The Duke cut his lamb with clean, practiced strokes. He did not look at the meat while he cut it. He looked instead at a point somewhere near the window as if he were calculating something or waiting for something to arrive from outside. His hands moved with complete certainty. He had hands that had never, Ilara thought, done anything uncertain. They signed documents, they shook the hands of important men, they rested on the arms of chairs, and now they cut lamb. Everything with the same level of attention, which was to say, very little. A footman appeared at Ilara's left shoulder and removed the cold soup without comment. She had not asked for it to be removed. She had not touched it. But this was a house where things happened according to a schedule set long before she arrived, and cold soup was removed at this house as automatically as curtains were drawn at dusk. It was at this moment, while the footman was moving silently toward the kitchen doors, while the lamb was still being cut at the far end of the table, while the candles threw a soft and entirely dishonest warmth over the room, that Edmund put down his fork and knife with a sound that was not quite loud but was deliberate. The way you set something down when you intend for the sound to say something. Ilara looked up. He was looking at her now, directly at her. His eyes were dark gray, a color that looked different depending on the light, and in this light they looked the color of the sky before a storm that has already decided to come and is simply on its way. He said without any introduction, without softening the edges of it in any way, "I will require a successor. That is the purpose of this marriage." I assumed that was understood. If it was not understood, I am telling you now. I will not be entertaining other kinds of conversation at this table. He picked up his fork and knife again. He resumed eating. The footman, who had returned to stand near the sideboard, kept his eyes on the wall behind Ilara's head. His face showed nothing. His face was the face of a man who had learned in this house that the walls heard everything and that the only safe thing was to pretend to be part of the wall yourself. Ilara did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the space across the table where her husband was eating his lamb as if nothing had happened, as if he had simply commented on the weather, as if he had said the roads were good this time of year or that the deer had been seen in the north field again. She had not been prepared for this. She thought she had been prepared for a certain kind of coldness, the polite variety, the kind that wore a good coat and used the correct form of address and simply kept its distance. That kind of coldness she could manage. She had managed cold things before. She had grown up in a house where money was careful and joy was reasonable, and love was expressed most clearly by people who stayed when they could have left. She knew how to exist alongside things that were not warm. But this was different. This was not distance. Distance implies that something is far away. Distance means that somewhere at some point there might be a closing of the gap. What Edmund had just said was not distance. It was a wall, and walls do not close gaps. Walls announce that the gap is the point. She became aware that her hands had tightened in her lap. She loosened them deliberately, the way you do when you realize that showing tension is a form of honesty you are not yet prepared to offer. She reached forward and poured herself a glass of water. Her hand was steady. She was slightly amazed that her hand was steady. She lifted the glass and drank from it with the measured pace of someone who is in no hurry, who has all the time in the world, who is simply having an ordinary dinner on an ordinary evening. She set the glass down. Edmund did not look up. The lamb course was cleared. A dish of roasted vegetables arrived. Ilara took some. She ate them slowly, tasting nothing. Her mind was very loud in a way that her face was not showing. She thought about what he had said, the words themselves, the way he had arranged them, the absence of any attempt to soften them. She thought about the footman standing at the sideboard, about how many times this footman had stood in this room during meals in this house, about how many things he had heard, and she understood that what had just happened was not unusual in this house. This was the house as it had always been. She was the new element. She was the thing that did not yet fit. Dinner ended the way it had begun, in silence. Edmund folded his napkin, stood, said nothing to her and walked out. His footsteps were unhurried on the stone floor. She heard them until she could not, and then she heard the quiet settling of the house around her, the tick of the clock near the window, the small sound of a candle flame doing nothing except burning. She sat at the table for another few minutes. She was not sure why, perhaps because leaving immediately after he left would feel like following him, perhaps because she needed the room to herself for just a moment. The footman and the other member of the household staff were still in the room, standing with the patient stillness of people trained to be invisible, and she was aware of them but chose not to be. She allowed herself those few minutes in which she stared at nothing, and let the evening settle over her like something heavy. Then she stood, set her own napkin on the table with care, and walked out. Her bedroom was on the east side of the house, on the second floor at the end of a corridor lined with paintings. The paintings were all of people who had lived in this house before she arrived. Some of them had kind faces. Some had the same gray eyes as Edmund. One woman near the end of the corridor had a look in her painted expression that Ilara had noticed before, not sad, not angry, but settled, as if she had decided something a long time ago and had not changed her mind since. Ilara had looked at that painting before and thought it was simply the style of the era, that kind of still, flat expression that painters in old centuries had given to their subjects, because anything more animated might have seemed undignified. But tonight, she looked at that woman and thought something different. She thought that this woman had known exactly what was happening in her life and had made a decision about how to carry it. She went to her room. The maid who attended her in the evenings, a young woman named Clara who had been with the house for 2 years and who had a gift for quiet that Ilara genuinely appreciated, was already in the room, laying out things for the night. Clara greeted her with a nod and asked, with the brevity she always used, whether Ilara needed anything. "Nothing, thank you," Ilara said. Her voice was level. Clara accepted this with the ease of someone accustomed to short answers and went about her tasks. When Clara had gone, Ilara sat at her writing desk. The desk was by the window that looked east, over the gardens that were now dark, over the shapes of hedgerows and the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the estate. The night was clear and the moon was not yet up, and the sky was very dark and full of stars in the particular way it only is far from cities, where there is nothing else bright enough to argue with them. She had a journal. She had kept one since she was 14, which meant she had been keeping one for 12 years. The journal she was currently in was a green one, bought in the town she had grown up in, from a small shop that sold paper goods. It had her initials pressed into the front cover in gold. She opened it to a new page. She sat with the pen in her hand for a moment and did not write anything. Then she wrote a single sentence. She wrote, "He has told me what I am for." She closed the journal. She did not add anything else. There was nothing else she could have added that would have said more. She did not sleep for a long time that night. She lay in the wide bed in the dark room and listened to the house. Old houses have particular sounds specific to themselves, the way people have particular voices. This house had deep sounds, slow and settled, the sounds of stone and old wood that have stood for so long they no longer make any effort. The corridor outside her room sometimes had footsteps in it, staff moving from one part of the house to another, and she had learned to distinguish which footsteps were which. She knew Edmund's footsteps. She heard them pass her door at some point in the late evening and continue to the other end of the corridor without pause. She was not sure what she had expected. She was honest enough with herself to admit that she had not expected love, not immediately. She had understood from the beginning that this marriage had been arranged for reasons that did not begin with affection. Her family was connected to the right people, and Edmund Harwick needed a wife from a certain kind of background to satisfy certain requirements having to do with inheritance law and the expectations of his family's broader social network. These things had been explained to her, not unkindly, by her mother, who was a practical woman who had learned to value honesty because it hurt less than surprises. She had agreed to the marriage because honestly she had thought it offered something real, not romance but something, a household, a position, a life with a structure she could grow inside. She had come here prepared to be a partner in something, to be useful, to build something over time that might not look like warmth at first but could become it. What she had not prepared for was the specific nature of being told, at a dinner table, in the presence of a footman, without any softness or hesitation or even the basic courtesy of using her name, that her presence in this house had a single function. She lay in the dark and thought about this for a long time. She thought about her mother, who was at home in the house where Ilara had grown up, probably reading by lamplight at this hour. She thought about her younger brother, who had made her laugh more consistently than anyone else she had ever known. She thought about the garden of the house she grew up in, which was not a grand garden, nothing like the grounds of Harwick Hall, but which had a pear tree that bloomed in spring and an old stone bench that was always a little warm in the afternoon sun. She thought about all the things that had formed her before this house, and she held them in her mind like objects she was checking to make sure were still there. They were still there. They were not gone. Edmund Harwick had said words at a dinner table and they were still there. She was still there. It was somewhere in this thinking, sometime in the deep quiet of the night, that something shifted inside her. She did not call it resolve yet. She was not ready to name it, but she felt it. The way you feel a change in the air before the season turns, not the change itself yet, but the announcement of it, the signal. She turned onto her side, she closed her eyes. She would not cry, not because crying was wrong, not because she was made of stone, but because the tears that this moment wanted from her were the tears of someone who believed she had no options, and she was not yet ready to believe that. She was not sure yet what options she had. She did not have a plan. She had only the beginning of something, the first edge of a thought too large to fit in a single night. But she held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile you found unexpectedly, and she carried it with her into the thin hours before morning, and when she finally slept, she slept in the particular way of someone who has made a quiet decision she is not yet ready to speak out loud. Outside the window, the stars continued their indifferent brightness. The grounds of Harwick Hall lay still and dark, and entirely unaware of what was beginning inside the stone walls. The next morning, Ilara came down to breakfast at the usual time. She dressed carefully. She wore a pale blue dress that suited her well and had her hair arranged simply. She sat at the breakfast table with good posture and ate toast with a steady hand and said, when the morning staff greeted her, "Good morning," in a clear and pleasant voice. Edmund was already gone. He had eaten early and left for his study, as he apparently did most mornings. She had not known this yet. Now she did. She noted it. She noted it the way you note the layout of a place you intend to understand very well. The day stretched out ahead of her, full of ordinary hours, and she moved through them with a careful, deliberate quiet. She read, she walked in the East Garden, she wrote a letter to her mother in which she mentioned the weather and the state of the hedgerows and nothing else. She ate lunch alone. She sat in the library for the afternoon and looked at the collection of books that lined every wall and told herself that this, at least, was something. This house had a very good library. Edmund appeared at dinner. They sat at the long table again. The candles were lit. The food came in courses. He did not speak to her. She did not speak to him. But something was different now, something that he could not have seen and that she did not show. Somewhere behind her eyes, in the part of her that was still fully and completely her own, something had settled into place, like a key that has just found its lock, like a breath taken all the way in before something important begins. She did not know yet what she was going to do. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was going to do something, and that it was going to be entirely on her terms. There was a photograph on the windowsill of the bedroom where Ilara had grown up. She was 9 in it, wearing a dress with a yellow collar, standing in front of the pear tree in the garden with her arms out to both sides as if she were about to take flight. She was laughing. Even in the photograph, the laugh was real, a full-body thing, the kind of laugh that fills a room even when the room is quiet. Even in a still image, the laugh was loud. Her mother had taken the photograph. Her mother had a gift for catching moments that seemed ordinary and turning out to be permanent. There were photographs all over that house, tucked into frames on shelves and hanging on walls and stuck to the edges of mirrors. Photographs of Elara as a baby, as a child, as a girl becoming something more. Photographs of her father before he died, when he was still well, standing in the garden or sitting in the reading chair by the window with a book he had probably already read twice. Photographs of her younger brother, George, at every age, in every state, serious, silly, asleep in a chair at Christmas with a piece of food still in his hand. That house was full of evidence that people lived there and loved each other. The shelves had books whose pages had been turned and returned so many times the spines were soft. The rugs had worn patches in the places where people stood most often. The kitchen table had marks on it from years of meals and homework and card games and conversations that lasted past midnight. Every room in that house knew it was used. Harwick Hall had no photographs. It had paintings, of course, very good ones, old ones in heavy frames with brass plates on the bottom that gave names and dates, but paintings are not photographs. Paintings are composed, arranged, deliberate. They show what the painter chose to show, which in the case of portraits in old houses is always the same thing: dignity, position, the particular set of the jaw that says this person knew their own importance. Photographs are different. Photographs catch you in the middle of something. Photographs show the laugh that was happening, not the one you planned. Elara walked through the halls of Harwick Hall in those first months and looked at the paintings and tried to find the people behind the dignity. Sometimes she thought she could. The woman in the corridor with the settled expression. A young boy in a painting on the first-floor landing who had managed to convey, despite the formality of the portrait, that he had somewhere else he would rather have been. A dog in the background of one large painting, looking at something outside the frame with the pure urgency that dogs have, indifferent to the fact that someone was supposed to be posing. She found comfort in these small things. Elara had been raised by a woman named Harriet, which was her mother's name, and Harriet was the kind of woman who did not take up much space in a room but made the room feel different when she was in it. Harriet was not a tall woman. She was not a loud woman. She was not a woman who entered conversations and turned them toward herself. But she was the woman everyone called first when something happened, good or bad, because she had the particular quality of knowing what to say and, more importantly, when to say nothing. Elara's father had been a man called William. He had been a schoolteacher before his health made it difficult, and then he had been a scholar at home, which is to say he had read everything and helped anyone who asked and believed with conviction that knowledge was the most honest thing a person could own. He had taught Elara to read properly, not just the words but the sense behind them, the purpose of every sentence, the way that a good paragraph was like a good argument, every piece in the right place for a reason. He had died when Elara was 19. She still thought about him most days. She had grown up between these two people and her brother George, and the house they shared, and the garden, and the town, and the small round of life that was theirs. It was not a life that appeared in newspapers or that other people envied. Nobody pointed at their family when they walked into a room and whispered names the way they whispered the name Harwick. Nobody sent them invitations to events they were not quite important enough to attend but received anyway as a courtesy. Their life was ordinary in the way that a fire in a grate is ordinary, not impressive to look at, not the subject of paintings, but exactly what you need when the nights are cold. She had been educated well. This was not an accident. Harriet had made sure of it. Harriet had the kind of practical belief in female education that came not from politics but from watching what happened to women who had none. Elara had studied history, literature, mathematics, and 3 languages. She had read enough philosophy to know she was not a philosopher. She had read enough poetry to know the difference between the kind written by people feeling something real and the kind written by people who admired the idea of feeling something. She had opinions. She had always had opinions. From the time she was very small, she had formed views on things, on whether the ending of a story was fair, on whether the person in the news story had done what they should have done, on whether the garden needed more of one kind of flower and less of another. Her father had encouraged this. He had told her more than once that opinion without thought was just noise, but thought without opinion was just homework. The point was to put them together. The point was to care about things and also know why. She cared about many things. She had cared, for instance, about the idea of this marriage, not in the sentimental way people say they care about marriage, dreaming of flowers and dresses and the particular look on someone's face when they see you walk toward them. She had cared about it in a more practical way. She had asked real questions before she agreed. She had wanted to know what the arrangement actually was, what would be expected of her, what she would have access to, what her position in the household would mean in terms of daily life and personal freedom, and the ability to continue having a life that was hers. She had been given answers to all of these questions. The answers had been given by the Duke's solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Potts, and by her own family's advisor, and by Edmund himself once briefly, in a meeting that lasted 20 minutes and was conducted with the brisk efficiency of a business transaction. Edmund had told her, in that meeting, that she would have the full resources of the household at her disposal, that she would be mistress of the estate in the domestic sense, and that he expected her to conduct herself appropriately at social engagements. He had not told her that appropriately meant silently. He had not told her that mistress of the estate meant ornament. He had not told her, in that room in that 20-minute meeting, what he told her 4 months later at the dinner table. Perhaps he had assumed she already knew. Perhaps it had not occurred to him that she needed to be told because it had not occurred to him that she might have expected something different. This was possible. Edmund Harwick was, from everything she could observe, a man who existed so completely inside his own understanding of how things worked that other understandings of how things worked were simply not real to him. They were not hostile to him. They simply did not register. She had thought about this a great deal in the days after the dinner. She had thought about what it meant to be a person who simply does not see the person in front of them. Not because they are cruel, though the effect of their actions might be cruel, but because they have never been required to. Edmund had grown up in this very house with these very walls. He had grown up as the son of the previous duke, and then the nephew of the one who held the title through a certain period, and then the heir, and then the duke himself. He had grown up being told that the shape of his life was the shape that life was supposed to take, and so everything that fit into that shape was right, and everything that did not fit was simply outside the frame, which was not quite the same as wrong, just not quite visible. This did not excuse him, she was clear-eyed enough to know that. But it did explain him, or at least it explained part of him, which was more than she had before, and having a partial explanation felt like having a handhold in a place where she had previously been trying to grip smooth stone. She wrote about this in her journal. She wrote a great deal in her journal in those first months. The journal became the conversation she was not having with anyone else. She wrote about what she observed, about what she thought, about the details of the house and its people, about the small moments in each day that were interesting or curious or unexpectedly beautiful. She wrote about the quality of light in the library in the afternoons. She wrote about the sound the wind made against the east-facing windows. She wrote about the way the head groundskeeper, a compact and weathered man named Oliver, spoke to the plants in the garden when he thought no one was listening. Not words exactly, but sounds, low and encouraging, the way you speak to something you believe in. She noticed things. She had always noticed things. She noticed that Harwick Hall, for all its grandeur, was a house run by its staff. Edmund gave instructions, of course. He was the Duke, but it was the housekeeper, Mrs. Tate, who actually ran the place, who held the household together with the efficiency and authority of someone who had been doing it for 20 years and had made it entirely hers. Mrs. Tate was a tall woman, gray-haired, with a face that had made its peace with seriousness a long time ago. She was correct with Alara, appropriately respectful, entirely professional. She was not warm, but she was fair, which is sometimes better. Alara had decided early on to respect Mrs. Tate, not in a deliberate, calculating way, but genuinely. Mrs. Tate had built something in this house. She had made it function. Alara understood what it was to build something and have it work, even if the scale was different. Her ability to observe and understand the people around her had been something she was privately proud of, not in a boastful way, but in the way that you are proud of a skill you developed through effort. It had come from reading. It had come from the years of sitting in the corner of rooms in her parents' house while adults talked, absorbing the way that what people said and what they meant were two different things, and that the distance between them was where all the real information lived. She applied this to Harwick Hall. She watched Edmund at meals when he did not know she was watching. She observed the way he held himself, always straight, never slouched, as if the straightness were structural rather than habitual, as if removing it would cause something to collapse. She noticed that he was more relaxed with his horse, which she had seen him ride twice in the early mornings from her east window, than he was with any person she had seen him interact with. With the horse he was different, less arranged. She had seen him laugh once in the stable yard at something the groom had said, and it had startled her, not because it was unkind, but because it was real, and real was the last thing she had expected from his face. She noticed that he read late at night. She could see the light under his study door when she passed. He read things with paper markers sticking out of them, pages folded and notes written in margins. She had seen his study once, briefly, when the door was open during the day and she had happened to pass. The desk was not the desk of a man who did not think. It was the desk of a man who thought about particular things, specific things, practical and legal and financial things, and who cared about those things with some intensity. She noticed that he was not, in the strictest sense, unkind to the staff. He was demanding, exacting, sometimes brusque, but she had not heard him be cruel. She had not witnessed the small cruelties that some people in positions of power exercised because they could. This was not nothing. This did not make him good. But it was a data point, and she collected data points the way some people collected more obvious things. She also noticed very carefully that he had not asked her a single question about herself since the wedding. Not one. Not what she read, not what she thought of the house, not what she had eaten for breakfast, not whether she had slept. Nothing. She was a person who had moved into his house, and he had not once asked a question that would require him to know her. This bothered her in a way she needed to look at honestly. It bothered her not because she needed him to love her. She had let go of that expectation before she had properly held it. It bothered her because it was a form of erasure that operated so quietly and so completely that she suspected Edmund did not know he was doing it. He was not looking at her and thinking, "I will not see this person." He was simply not looking at her. And the absence of the looking was the same as the absence of the thought. She was not there to him, not really, not as a person with an interior life and a history and a self that had been going on for 21 years before he existed in it. She sat in the library one afternoon with a book open on her lap that she was not reading, and she thought, "I could disappear inside this house. I could become a background. I could become one of the paintings in the corridor, present, visible to anyone who looked, but not looked at." She thought about the 9-year-old in the photograph by the pear tree, arms out, laughing, taking up space because space was there to be taken. She thought about her father, who had told her that knowledge was the most honest thing a person could own. She thought about her mother, who had sat across from her before the wedding and told her that marriages built on arrangements took time to warm, and who had also, in the same conversation, looked at Alara very directly and said, "But if it asks you to stop being yourself, that is a different conversation." She had not remembered that last part until just now. If it asks you to stop being yourself, Harriet had said that. Her mother, who chose her words with the precision of someone who believed that imprecision was a kind of waste. Stop being yourself. Alara looked at the book in her lap. She looked at the walls of the library. She looked at the afternoon light coming through the windows, gold and patient and entirely indifferent to everything happening in this room. She was not going to stop being herself. She was not sure yet what that meant in terms of this house, this marriage, this particular cold and complicated situation. She did not have a strategy. She was a 21-year-old woman in a very large house with a husband who had told her she existed to produce an heir and had not addressed her since. She was not in a position to be careless. But she was very much still herself. She was still the girl who had stood under the pear tree with her arms out, even if that girl was now a woman sitting in a library in a house that did not yet know what to make of her. The laugh was still in her. The opinions were still in her. The father's voice saying think and care and put them together was still in her. She would not disappear. She turned the page of her book. This time she read it. Outside, Oliver the groundskeeper was moving along the garden beds, checking the late-season roses. He paused at the bed nearest the library window, touched one of the stems, and said something very quiet to it, something that no one was supposed to hear. Alara saw him through the glass and smiled without meaning to. The house did not know what to make of her yet, but she was beginning to know what to make of it. And somewhere inside the enormous quiet of this place, something was already beginning to change, slowly, invisibly, the way things do when a person decides, without a great announcement, simply not to become what they are being told to become. She did not make the decision in a single moment. That was the thing no one would have believed about it afterward, that there was no single moment of fire, no scene where she stood up from a chair and said enough, no dramatic point at which everything shifted in a flash of clarity. It was slower than that. It was more careful than that. It came the way winter comes, not all at once but through a series of small, quiet announcements, each one easy to miss on its own, and only undeniable when you look back and see how many there were. It had been 6 weeks since the dinner. 6 weeks of meals at the long table. 6 weeks of passing each other in the corridors of this large house like two ships that had agreed, without discussing it, to maintain their distance. 6 weeks in which Edmund had spoken to her a total of 3 times, once to inform her about a guest who would be arriving for 2 nights, and what would be expected of her in terms of hosting duties, once to ask whether she had spoken to the solicitor about a property matter she had not been told was hers to handle, and once to tell her that the East Garden renovation she had quietly begun planning with Oliver would require his approval before it proceeded. She had responded to all 3 instances, briefly, clearly, without heat. The renovation discussion had been the most interesting one, because it was the only time she had sensed something close to actual attention from him. He had come to her in the morning room where she had been at her writing desk, and he had asked about the plans in a way that was not quite hostile but was not quite without a challenge in it either. She had explained what she wanted to do in the East Garden and why. She had explained it in the same calm, direct way her father had taught her to explain things, with the reasoning visible, so the other person could follow it and either find it sound or find the specific place where they disagreed. Edmund had listened. He had not said yes. He had not said no. He had stood in the doorway for a long moment and then left without committing to anything. The next day, Oliver had come to her quietly, in the way Oliver did everything, and told her that the Duke had approved the work to proceed. She had stored that away. In the 6th week, something happened that she had not anticipated. It was not a dramatic thing. It was barely a noticeable thing, and that was exactly why it mattered as much as it did. She had been in the library after lunch, sitting in the chair she had come to think of as hers, the one near the south window with the good afternoon light, reading a book on natural philosophy that she had found on the 3rd shelf and which turned out to be far more interesting than its faded cover had suggested. She was deeply into it when she heard Edmund in the corridor outside, his footsteps. She knew them by now. He was moving toward the library, probably going to his study, which was 3 rooms further down. But the footsteps stopped, outside the library door. There was a pause. She did not look up from her book. She kept her eyes on the page, though she was no longer reading. She was very aware of the pause. She was aware of the library door being slightly ajar and of the silence that was now holding itself on the other side of it. Then his footsteps moved on, toward his study. The corridor was quiet again. She sat with that for a moment, then she returned to her book. But she thought about it later that evening. She thought about it while Clara was arranging things in the bedroom, and she thought about it again when she was alone, at the writing desk, with the star-thick sky outside the window. She thought about why a man who had walked this corridor thousands of times would stop outside the library when the library was not where he was going. She thought about what might stop someone in a corridor they know as well as their own hands. And she thought about what it might mean that the thing that had stopped him was her presence, or the possibility of her presence, which was not nothing, whatever else it was. She wrote in her journal, "He stopped." 2 words, then she closed it. The decision did not come that night, not fully, but something connected that night. Something clicked, quietly, like the last number of a combination falling into place. The thought that had been forming since the dinner, that beginning of a beginning, found its shape in the 2 words she had written. He stopped. He stopped because she was there or might be there. He stopped because whatever she had become in this house, quiet, contained, fully present and fully unexplained, had begun to take up a kind of space that his certainty did not know what to do with. She was not fighting him. She was not arguing with him. She was not crying or complaining or demanding to be seen. She was simply being, and being turned out to have a weight to it that arguments did not. She thought about this for 3 more days. She lived her normal days, her reading and her garden and her letters and her meals, and underneath all of it she was thinking about the thing she was working toward, turning it from every angle, looking for the places where it was weak, finding them and looking more carefully. It was not about punishing him. She was clear on that from the beginning. This was not revenge, not the petty satisfaction of making someone feel what you felt. She had no interest in that kind of smallness. She had seen what bitterness did to people who fed it. She had a great-aunt who had nursed a grievance for 40 years and had turned it, through decades of daily attention, into something so solid it was all anyone knew about her. That was not who Alara intended to become. This was about something else. It was about the fact that Edmund Harwick had reduced her, in a single sentence at a dinner table, to a function, a biological necessity, a requirement to be met. He had not asked her anything, had not learned her, had not spent a single hour in her company before deciding that her company was not the point. And she had two choices. She could live inside that reduction, accept its frame, allow herself to be the thing he had called her, or she could do something else. The something else was the part she had been turning over. She thought about what she had her mind, which was working well, she had herself, which was intact, she had her journal, which was hers entirely, she had the library, which was extraordinary, she had the garden, which was becoming hers one bed at a time, she had Clara, who was quiet and good, she had Oliver, who talked to plants. She had the evening sky and the morning light, and the particular way the light came through the south library window in the afternoons, and the books, so many books. And she had her silence. This was the thing she had not fully considered until now. She had been treating her silence as a consequence, as the natural result of living with a man who did not speak to her, the silence of someone who has not been invited into a conversation. But what if silence could be something other than a consequence? What if it could be a choice? What if, instead of waiting to be spoken to and remaining quiet because no invitation came, she chose to be quiet, actively, deliberately, as a statement rather than a default? He had told her what she was for. What if she simply did not respond to that definition? Not with anger, not with argument, not with tears or demands or any of the weapons that people in difficult situations usually reached for, which are all ultimately the weapons of someone asking the other person to change. She was not going to ask Edmund to change. She was not going to spend her energy trying to move someone who had no awareness that he was standing in anyone's way. She was going to do something entirely different. She was going to remove herself from the conversation. Not from the house, not from the marriage, which was not something she could leave in any practical sense, and which she was not yet sure she wanted to leave, even if she could. She was going to remove herself from the conversation that he had defined. He had said, "You are here to give me an air, not to talk," and she was going to respond not by arguing the terms but by stepping entirely outside them. She would give him nothing to argue with, nothing to dismiss, nothing to refuse or accept. She would give him silence, the specific, particular silence of a woman who has decided that his definition of her is simply not the truth. She sat at her desk on the 9th evening after the corridor pause and opened her journal. She wrote, "I will not speak to him until I choose to." She looked at the sentence, then she wrote, "Not silence from helplessness, silence as sovereignty." She closed the journal and sat for a long time in the dark with the stars outside the window. The practical details of it came to her slowly over the next few days. She thought through the reality of it. She lived in his house. She sat at his table. She would encounter him. There would be guests who expected a certain performance from the Duchess. There would be social situations, household decisions, moments where the absence of speech would be noticed, perhaps questioned, perhaps reported. She could not disappear into the East Garden for a year and simply never cross his path. So she thought carefully about the rules. The rules were hers. She was making this. She could make it how she needed it to be. She would still speak to the staff. She would still speak to guests. She would still write letters, manage the household's domestic affairs, exist in the world with full voice and engagement. What she would not do was speak directly to Edmund. She would not initiate a single sentence toward him. If he addressed her in company, she would respond to the company. She would communicate if anything urgent required it in writing. She would leave notes as he had done for practical matters before and as the house's business occasionally required. She would not shout this decision. She would not announce it. She would not send him a letter explaining what she was doing or why. He would notice or he would not notice, and either answer would be in itself its own information. She gave herself one more day to be sure. On that day she walked through the East Garden in the morning while Oliver was working. She watched him for a while without interrupting, and then she asked him a question about the soil composition near the old oak, and he answered her in his careful, earth-heavy way, and she thanked him, and he nodded in the way that was his version of a full conversation. She went back inside and read until lunch. She ate lunch in the morning room as she had taken to doing, where the light was better. She wrote 2 letters, one to her mother, one to a childhood friend named Helen who lived in the north of the country and whom Ilara had been corresponding with since they were 13. In the letter to Helen, she said only that she was finding her way and that the library was excellent and that she missed good conversations. She read until dinner. At dinner she came to the table as she always did at the right time in a good dress with her hair arranged and her posture straight. Edmund was already seated. The candles were lit. The soup was cream-based again, a different kind with a different herb oil swirl, the kitchen's quiet creativity continuing regardless of what was happening at either end of the table. He glanced at her when she sat. He said nothing. She lifted her spoon and began her soup while it was still warm. He spoke once during the meal to ask the footman to bring more bread. She noticed that. She noted the tone of it, businesslike and brief. She noted that he did not offer her the bread when it arrived, that he simply helped himself without any awareness that there was another person at the table who might also want bread. She noticed all of this with the same calm interest she had applied to everything in this house. She was a person who noticed things. She was going to keep being a person who noticed things. After dinner, as Edmund rose from the table and turned to leave, he paused, the smallest pause just at the doorway. She felt it rather than saw it. He had stopped, perhaps expecting that she might say something, the good night that polite people said at the end of an evening, the basic acknowledgement. She had said it sometimes those 4 months. She had offered those social courtesies. She looked down at her napkin and folded it. He left. She folded her napkin with precision, lay it on the table and stood. She walked to the doorway and went toward her room. In the corridor she passed the painting of the woman with the settled expression. She looked at her directly this time. The woman in the painting looked back with that expression that was neither sad nor angry but simply decided. Ilara understood her now. She went to her desk, she opened her journal, and at the top of a fresh page she wrote the date and underneath it a single line, "Today it begins." She closed the journal. She did not feel afraid. She had expected to feel afraid. She felt something else instead, something harder to name, something that lived in the chest rather than the stomach, in the region of the heart rather than the region of fear. Something that felt, very quietly and without performance, like the beginning of being fully oneself. Outside, the grounds of Harwick Hall were still and dark. The east garden was sleeping. The roses were closed. Oliver had gone home for the evening. The stars were doing what they always did, which was continuing to exist with complete indifference to everything below them. Inside, at the far end of the east corridor, the light in Edmund's study was still on. She did not think about that. She turned out her own lamp and went to sleep. The first morning of it was a Wednesday. She came down at the usual time. Edmund was in the breakfast room, which was unusual. He normally ate early and left before she arrived. But that morning he was still there when she walked in, standing at the sideboard with a cup of coffee, reading a folded newspaper. He looked up when she entered. She met his eyes, gave the smallest nod that was still a nod, took a plate, and began to help herself to breakfast without a word. He watched her for a moment, then he went back to his newspaper. She sat and ate her breakfast with the particular ease of someone who has decided something and no longer needs to worry about whether she is going to decide it. Clara, who came in to ask about the morning schedule, she spoke to warmly. The footman who brought fresh tea she thanked by name. She spoke to the room the way she always had, openly, pleasantly, with the full warmth that was naturally hers. Just not to him. He left after 10 minutes. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, which she had not heard him gather himself to take but simply noticed when they were already moving away. She sat with her tea and the remainder of her breakfast and thought, day 1. It did not feel like a war. She wanted to be very clear with herself about that. She was not waging a war. She was not retaliating. She was not keeping score. She was simply living inside a decision she had made with care, and the decision was about her own life, her own voice, her own terms. She finished her breakfast, thanked the staff and went to the library. She had a great deal to read. The second morning was a Thursday. Edmund came to the breakfast room again. She wondered if he was changing his schedule or if this had always been the schedule and she had simply not been there early enough to know it. She greeted Clara, who came with the morning tea. She spoke briefly with the footman about a delivery expected in the afternoon. She ate, read a portion of a letter she had received from Helen, and left. Edmund, who had again been reading his newspaper at the other end of the sideboard, watched her leave. She was not looking at him when he did this. She knew because she felt it, not in a supernatural way, nothing like that, simply in the way that you feel the fact of attention even when you cannot see it. She had learned to trust that particular sense. She walked down the corridor and noted, with a certain private precision, that this was beginning. The first person to notice was Clara. Clara had been with Harwick Hall for 2 years. She was 20 years old, careful, observant, and far more intelligent than her position required her to be. She noticed things about people the way certain people notice things about weather, not with effort but with an instinct so practiced It had become automatic. She noticed the way Mrs. Tate tightened the left corner of her mouth when something in the household did not meet her standard. She noticed the way the youngest footman, a recent hire named Peter, always glanced at the clock above the dining room doorway when he was anxious. She noticed everything because her job required her to anticipate needs, and you cannot anticipate needs without watching people. She noticed within the first 3 days that the Duchess was not speaking to the Duke. This required careful observation, because the Duchess spoke to everyone else with the same warmth and ease she always had. She spoke to Clara about the day's schedule and asked about Clara's mother, who had been unwell the previous month. She spoke to Oliver about the East Garden with the focused interest of someone who genuinely cared how it was going. She spoke to Mrs. Tate about household arrangements with the brisk efficiency that Mrs. Tate responded to best. She spoke to guests, and there were 2 visitors in that first week, a pair of gentlemen who came to discuss estate business with the Duke, with perfect social grace, asking the right questions, remembering the right details, making the meal pleasant in the way that a good hostess does. But she did not say one word directly to the Duke. Clara was careful. She did not discuss this with the other staff. She was not a woman who traded information about the household the way some staff in large houses did, passing observations back and forth in the kitchen like currency. She kept what she saw to herself and turned it over privately, the way you do with something that matters. What she saw in those first weeks was not what she had expected to see. She had expected when she noticed the silence that the Duchess would look strained. She had expected tension in the way the Duchess moved through the house, the particular tightness that people carry when they are doing something that costs them. Instead, the Duchess moved through the house with what Clara could only describe privately as ease, not performing ease, not the forced lightness of someone pretending everything was fine, actual ease. The ease of someone who had put something down that was heavy and was relieved to be without it. She seemed, Clara thought, more like herself. Whatever that self was, Clara did not know her well enough yet to say with certainty. The Duchess seemed more present in her own life in those weeks than she had in the months before. She spent longer in the library. She spent more time in the garden. She wrote a great many letters, and from the number of times she sealed and dispatched them, she was corresponding with people she cared about. She laughed twice in the morning room at something in a letter, a real laugh, the kind that surprised even the person doing it. Clara thought about all of this and said nothing to anyone. The second person to notice was Mrs. Tate. Mrs. Tate noticed on day 11. She had been in the household through the tenure of the previous Duke, and before that she had been in service in 2 other large houses. She had seen a great many kinds of marriages. She had seen marriages that were openly unhappy, full of noise and recrimination. She had seen marriages that were professionally managed, all courtesy on the surface and complete distance underneath. She had seen marriages that surprised her by becoming something genuine late in life, people who had been politely strangers for a decade, and then, through some shift she could never quite identify, became genuinely kind to each other. She had not, in 30 years of service, seen anything quite like what was happening at Harwick Hall. What she had seen was this. On day 11, the Duke had come to find her in the linen room, where she was overseeing an inventory. He had asked in his usual direct manner whether the Duchess had communicated any preference about the menu for the following week's guest dinner. Mrs. Tate had told him that the Duchess had, in fact, sent her a very clear written note about the menu that morning, with specific requests for 3 courses and a suggestion about the wine pairing that Mrs. Tate found quite sensible. The Duke had said nothing for a moment, then he had said thank you and left. Mrs. Tate stood in the linen room for a moment after he left. She was a woman who did not allow herself to speculate in general. Speculation was the kind of indulgence that could lead a household manager into territory she had no business being in. But she allowed herself one moment of it, standing between the stacked white linens and what she thought was, so the Duchess is managing the household fully, correctly, and without him. Then she went back to the inventory. It was the 21st day when the first social test came. Edmund had a cousin named Frederick who visited perhaps 3 times a year. Frederick was a pleasant man, approximately 45, with an ease about him that Edmund entirely lacked, the kind of ease that comes from being the person in the family who is not carrying the title. Frederick had met Alara at the wedding and had been, from what Alara could recall, genuinely friendly, the first member of Edmund's family to ask her a question about herself, and then actually listen to the answer. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Edmund received him in the front hall. Alara was coming down the stairs at that moment, having heard the carriage, and she greeted Frederick with the warmth she felt was genuine. She shook his hand, said she was glad to see him, asked about his journey. Frederick, who had the social antennae of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms, looked between them. Edmund said nothing to Alara. Alara said nothing to Edmund. The greeting was completed between Frederick and Alara, and then the three of them walked toward the drawing room, and the conversation was carried by Frederick, who asked questions and received answers from Alara and occasional brief responses from Edmund, and the whole thing proceeded in a way that was technically correct and absolutely unusual. At dinner that evening, Frederick tried something. He addressed a remark to Edmund about the North Road repairs, and then in the same breath turned to Alara and said, "Edmund was telling me last week that you have been redesigning the East Garden. I'd love to hear about it. What are you planning?" Alara, who had been very slightly watching for exactly this kind of moment, smiled at Frederick genuinely, not performing, and told him about the East Garden. She talked about the soil work Oliver had done, about the plant choices and the reasons behind them, about the stone path she wanted to add along the eastern wall, where the light was particularly good in the mornings. She talked about it with the interest and knowledge of someone who had put real thought into it, which she had. Frederick listened with genuine attention. He asked questions. He offered a thought about a garden he had seen in the south of the country that had done something similar with the path idea. Edmund ate his lamb. He did not look at his plate the entire time Alara was speaking. He looked, she thought, at a point somewhere between his plate and Frederick's face, the particular look of someone who is listening without intending to. His fork continued its slow and measured work, but the speed of it had changed in a way that was almost undetectable unless you were watching for it. She was watching for it. She registered it and moved on. After dinner, Frederick found a moment alone with Alara in the drawing room, while Edmund was fetching a document from his study. He was not blunt about it. Frederick was never blunt. He was too good at people for bluntness, but he asked her very gently how she was settling in. It was a question with another question inside it, and they both knew it. She said she was settling in well. She said she had found the library. She said the East Garden was something she was genuinely enjoying. She said Clara was excellent and Oliver was exceptional company. Frederick smiled. He had a kind smile, the kind that reached without pushing. He said, "Edmund is better than he appears, you know, that is not nothing. Worse than he appears would be considerably more difficult." She looked at Frederick for a moment, then she said in a voice that was honest but not unkind, "I know. That is part of what makes it interesting." Frederick looked at her for a moment longer than he might have otherwise. Then he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. He shook his head slightly, the way people do when they have just been impressed by something they did not expect to be impressed by. He said nothing else about it, and she was grateful for that. Edmund returned with his document. The evening continued. At its end, Frederick said good night to both of them in the corridor, and Edmund said good night to Frederick, and Alara said good night to Frederick, and the corridor contained for a moment the specific silence of two people who are standing in the same space and not in the same conversation. The next morning, Frederick left early. He sought out Alara briefly before the carriage came in the morning room, and told her that she had a beautiful mind and an even better instinct for living in difficulty, and then he pressed her hand once, in the way of an ally acknowledging something without speaking it, and was gone. She sat with that for a while. It was good to be seen. She had not known how much she needed it until it happened. Not Edmund seeing her, she was working deliberately and carefully toward something other than that, but Frederick seeing her was different. Frederick had looked at her and recognized what was there, not just a pretty woman in a difficult situation, but a person making specific, considered choices for reasons she had thought through. She went to the library. The weeks continued. The silence held. Edmund had begun, she noticed, to vary his movements. He appeared in rooms where he had not appeared before, not lingering, not seeking her out in any obvious sense, but present in the corridor when she was coming from the garden, in the entrance hall when she was returning from a walk. She noticed this the way she noticed everything. She noted it without drawing conclusions she was not yet ready to draw. The household, for its part, had settled around the silence the way water settles around a stone. It adjusted. It found its flow. Mrs. Tate ran things as she always had. Clara attended to Alara with the quiet efficiency that had become one of the steady comforts of Alara's days. Oliver continued to talk to the plants, and the garden continued to become more and more beautiful, the east beds opening into something structured and wild at the same time, the way Alara had wanted. The house was alive. She was alive in it. Her days had a texture and a purpose that she had built herself, out of what was available, without asking permission and without announcing what she was doing. She wrote to her mother more often. She wrote to Helen long letters that took her a full afternoon to compose. She read more than she had ever read in her life. She thought clearly, in a way that the first 4 months had made difficult, and the clarity felt like something she had misplaced and found again. She did not think much about whether what she was doing was working. Working implied a goal that someone else would confirm. She had no interest in that. She was simply living, as fully and as truly as the circumstances allowed, and the living was its own point. But on the evening of the 28th day she was reading in the library when she heard Edmund stop outside the door again. She had her book, the fire was going, the room was warm. She kept her eyes on the page. She heard him stop and she heard the pause, and this time the pause was longer than the first time, considerably longer, long enough that she counted without meaning to something like 25 before she heard him continue down the corridor. She looked up at the door. She wrote in her journal that night, 25. She did not add anything else. She did not need to. The 35th day brought a formal dinner. 6 guests. 3 were connected to Edmund's work with the estate, men who talked about land and law and numbers with the focused energy of people for whom these were the most interesting things in the world. Their wives were pleasant, reasonably curious, and accustomed to the particular kind of conversation that happened at these tables. Ilara had prepared. She knew that a formal dinner required her full participation in a way that ordinary evenings did not. She was the Duchess. The table was hers to manage, in the social sense. She wore a deep green dress that suited her well and had arranged her hair with Clara's help into something that was elegant without trying to announce itself. She came down to the drawing room before the guests arrived, positioned herself correctly, and greeted each person as they came in with the genuine warmth that she had and that, she knew, no silence could take from her. The dinner was excellent. She directed the conversation with the practiced skill of someone who had been watching how conversations worked since she was a child, and had spent the last year reading so widely that she could honestly engage with almost any topic brought to the table. She asked one of the estate men about his views on a land reform proposal she had read about in the paper that week, and his eyebrows went up slightly at the specificity of the question, and then he answered it with real engagement, surprised into treating her as an equal. His wife, a sharp-faced woman named Anne who had barely looked at Ilara when they arrived, was watching her differently by the second course. Edmund sat at the head of the table, she sat at the foot. Between them the conversation moved like a good river. She sent it one way, it came back another, she redirected, it broadened. Every time a remark passed near Edmund she left it for the person who had made it to deliver to him directly, which they did, because the dinner was going well and people in well-running dinners speak freely. Edmund participated. He answered questions. He offered twice observations that were brief and precise and unexpectedly interesting. She noted those, she had not expected them. The dinner went on for 3 pleasant hours. When it was done and the guests had moved to the sitting room for an hour before their carriages, one of the wives, not Anne, another one, a quieter woman named Grace, had come to stand beside Ilara near the window and said very quietly that she had not been to a dinner at Harwick Hall before, but she had heard it was rather formal, and that she had been delighted to be wrong. Ilara thanked her. After the guests left, Edmund and Ilara were briefly in the entrance hall together as the last carriage rolled away. He turned and she was there, and for a fraction of a second something moved across his face that she categorized, as carefully as she could, as something between surprise and the beginning of a thought. Then the usual arrangement of his face returned, and he turned and went toward his study. She watched him go. She turned and went toward her room. In the corridor with the paintings, she paused at the woman with the settled expression. The candlelight from the wall sconces was the same warm, dishonest gold it always was, and the woman in the painting looked back from whatever century she had lived in with that expression that was neither sad nor proud, but simply present. Ilara nodded at her, just slightly, the way you nod at someone who understands what you are doing. Then she went to bed. She slept extremely well. The 42nd day was a Sunday. She walked in the East Garden after breakfast. The work Oliver had done was showing now in visible ways. The new beds had taken hold. The path along the eastern wall was half laid, and the old overgrown corner near the oak had been cleared and replanted with something low and silver that caught the light in the mornings in a way she found genuinely beautiful. She was standing near the oak when she heard steps on the garden path behind her. She turned, expecting Oliver. It was Edmund. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and was looking at the garden with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of someone genuinely looking at something rather than observing it for any practical purpose. He walked along the path slowly, not toward her specifically, taking in the east beds, the cleared corner, the new planting. She did not move. She stayed near the oak and watched him. He came within 20 feet of her and stopped. He looked at the silver planting near the eastern wall. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, not to her, not directly, not with the expectation of an answer, but in the way people sometimes think out loud when they forget they are not alone, "It's better." She looked at the planting. She did not respond. He stood there another moment, then turned and walked back toward the house. She looked at the eastern wall for a long time after he left. Then she smiled very quietly to herself and bent to look at the silver plants more closely. They were growing well. They were going to be beautiful in the spring. By the third month, the house had reorganized itself around what was happening without anyone naming what it was. This was, Ilara had come to understand, one of the remarkable properties of large households run by experienced staff. They adapted. They were designed to adapt. The whole machinery of a house like Harwick Hall was built to function correctly regardless of what was happening between the people at its center. It had done this before her. It would do it after her. Mrs. Tate managed. The kitchen produced meals. The linens were changed. The fires were set and the candles were replaced and the horses were cared for and the accounts were balanced. And all of this happened the way the seasons happened, without anyone needing to be told or approve or feel well about it. Into this machinery, Ilara had inserted herself steadily over the 3 months, not aggressively, not in a way that stepped on anyone's established function, but she had found the places where the household could use a guiding hand, and she had applied hers thoughtfully. The guest rooms on the south side, which had not been properly aired since the previous spring, she had thoroughly prepared. The kitchen garden, which Oliver said had been operating below its potential for 2 years, she had asked him to expand in the way he had been wanting to. The household accounts, which she had asked Mrs. Tate to walk her through in the second month, she had gone over carefully and found 3 places where money was being spent on arrangements that were outdated, inherited from the time of the previous Duke, and could be reorganized to better effect. She had sent Mrs. Tate a note about the accounts. Mrs. Tate had come to her the following morning in the morning room, and they had sat across from each other at the writing desk for the first time as actual collaborators, rather than as the new Duchess and the entrenched housekeeper who were professionally respecting each other while privately reserving judgment. The meeting had lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, something had shifted between them. Not friendship, that was not what either of them was looking for, but something more useful than politeness, something more like mutual recognition. She had also by this point developed a daily rhythm that suited her well. She rose at a reasonable hour and dressed with Clara's help. She came down to breakfast where she read the newspaper and the Morning Post and drank tea and spoke with whoever was in the room, always warmly, always with real attention. After breakfast she spent 2 hours in the library, which was the fixed central point of her days, the thing she had organized everything else around. After the library she went to the garden if the weather was agreeable, and to the morning room if it was not. Lunch was usually a simple affair she managed on her own. The afternoons were free in a way she had learned to value. They could be anything. Letters, reading, visiting the kitchen to discuss menus, sitting in the garden watching the light, taking a walk along the outer paths of the estate where the trees were old and the ground was soft. Evenings were dinners. Some evenings there were guests. Most evenings it was just Edmund and herself at the long table, in the usual arrangement, in the usual silence, which was no longer the silence of 2 strangers but the silence of 2 people who had become, in a strange way, intensely aware of each other across the length of that table. She had begun to notice, in the 3rd month, that Edmund was different in small ways. He still did not speak to her. He still sat at his end of the table and attended to his food and his own thoughts, and on evenings with guests, to the business of hosting. He still passed her in corridors without acknowledgement. He still occupied the house with the particular quality of a man who had always been its center and could not quite adjust to the fact that the center had shifted. But the small ways were real. He had begun to appear at breakfast on mornings when he had not previously done so. She had noticed this in the 6th week and had confirmed it to herself by the 8th. He was deliberately shifting his morning schedule so that he was at breakfast at the same time she was, not sitting near her, still at his end of the sideboard, still with his newspaper, but there in the room at the same time. She did not comment on this. She did not change her own schedule. She came at her usual time and did her usual things and spoke to Clara and the footman, and occasionally to Oliver when he came in from the garden with a question, and she did not acknowledge the fact of Edmund being there with anything more than the same small nod she gave him as a basic minimum of the civilization they were both committed to maintaining. He had also, she noticed, begun to read different things. This was how she knew it, the library. Edmund rarely used the library. He had a study, and his study had shelves of books along 2 walls, and those were the books he read, practical books, legal references, documents, ledgers, things related to the work of running an estate of this size. The library was a household resource, not his personal collection, and he used it the way he used most things in the house that were not directly related to his work, not at all. But in the 3rd month she began to notice that certain books in the library were not exactly where she had left them. She was organized about where she placed things. She had a specific way of returning books to the shelf that was habitual and consistent, and she began in the 9th week to notice that sometimes a book she had been reading and had left in a certain spot, marked to a certain page, was at the correct spot, marked to the correct page, but something about it was different. The weight of it, the way the pages fell when she opened it. Someone had read further than her bookmark and then put it back. She stood in the library one afternoon, holding a book about natural philosophy, and thought about what this meant. He was reading her books, not borrowing them. There was no conversation happening in which he could have asked, not leaving any indication that he had taken them. He was reading them and replacing them and saying nothing and leaving her to notice or not notice. She thought about that for a long time. She did not write about it in her journal that night. She wrote about the East Garden, which was progressing well. She wrote a long passage about a letter she had received from Helen, who had shared news of her own small life with the generosity of a true friend. She wrote about a passage in the natural philosophy book she had found remarkable. She did not write about the books. She kept that private, even from herself, in the way that you sometimes keep the things that matter most from the instruments you use to organize your thinking, because naming them too soon can do something to them. It was in the 10th week that Edmund made his first attempt to engage her directly in front of other people. There were 4 guests at dinner, including Frederick, who visited again that month. The other 3 were connected to Edmund's family in a more distant way, an older man named Herbert, who had the air of someone accustomed to having the most authority in any room, and his wife, whose name was Constance and who had clearly spent many years managing the social consequence of being married to a man like Herbert. With them was a younger man, a nephew of some kind, who was perhaps 25 and had the slightly overwhelmed manner of someone who had not yet worked out what he was. Dinner proceeded. Alara had planned the menu carefully, and it was good. The conversation flowed in the way it did when she was directing it, with ease and warmth and the occasional redirect when it threatened to stagnate. Herbert, who liked to hear himself talk at length, required several of these redirects, which she accomplished without his noticing. Near the end of the 2nd course, Edmund turned very deliberately, very intentionally, not accidentally, and addressed a remark directly to Alara. He said, "You were telling me last week about the East Garden and what you found when you cleared the oak corner. Tell our guests." She felt the remark like a small stone dropped into still water. He had said, "You were telling me." They had not spoken, she had not told him anything. He was constructing, for the guests, a version of them in which they had conversations. He was reaching, for whatever reason, for the appearance of a marriage in which his wife spoke to him about things she cared about. She registered this. She registered it in full in all its complexity, the calculation in it, the need it revealed, the fact that he had chosen at this dinner in front of these people to present them as having a different relationship than the one they actually had. And she felt, alongside all of this, a small, sharp recognition of something she had not expected. He was asking her, in his deeply inconvenient and entirely wrong-footed way, to help him. She looked at Frederick briefly. He was watching her with the same quiet attention he always gave to whatever she was doing. His face was neutral but alive. He would not intervene, he would watch. She turned to Constance, who was seated near her, and she said with warm ease, "I was telling Oliver, he is our head groundskeeper and something of an expert on these grounds, about what we found when we cleared the corner near the old oak. Oliver discovered that the soil there has been improved by years of leaf fall from the oak and is actually quite remarkable. He suggested silver-leafed ground cover to take advantage of it, and he was entirely right. It has taken hold beautifully. She spoke entirely to Constance. She spoke of Oliver with the genuine appreciation she felt for him. She told the story of the garden corner with real interest and care. She did not look at Edmund once. Constance was delighted. She asked 3 follow-up questions. Herbert, briefly left out of the conversation, reached for the wine. The young nephew listened with the look of someone who was not interested in gardens, but was very interested in watching this room. Frederick caught her eye across the table once. He said nothing. He raised his glass slightly in a gesture that was too small for anyone else to see. She smiled at him briefly and turned to answer Constance's next question. Edmund ate his food. After dinner in the corridor, she heard him behind her as she moved toward the stairs. She did not slow her pace. She did not turn. She climbed the stairs at her normal speed, said good night quietly to Clara in the upstairs corridor, and went to her room. She sat at her desk. She wrote, "He is beginning to feel what it is to be unheard." She paused, then she wrote, "I hope it is instructive." She closed the journal. She sat for a moment with her hands on top of it. She was not angry. She examined herself carefully and found she was not angry. She was something more precise than that. She was clear. She was very clear about what was happening and why and what it meant. She was also, she noticed, very tired, not emotionally tired, not the exhausted tiredness of someone fighting something. A different kind of tired, the physical tiredness of someone who has been fully alive for a very long day. The kind of tired that leads to good sleep. She went to sleep. Outside, the October wind had found the east side of the house. The garden was dark, but the silver plants were there, in the corner by the oak, doing what they were going to do regardless of whether anyone was watching. Holding, growing, becoming slowly and without announcement exactly what they had been planted to become. The 11th week brought the first real disruption. Edmund had an engagement. He was traveling to the city for 4 days, for meetings connected to the legal side of the estate and a matter involving the title that required his presence at a solicitor's office. He told her this, not personally, but through a note left with Mrs. Tate, which Mrs. Tate relayed to Alara with the neutral efficiency that characterized everything Mrs. Tate did. He left on a Monday. She watched the carriage go from the east window of the library. She stood with her book in her hand and watched it move down the long drive between the trees and disappear at the turn, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Quiet. Not just the physical quiet of the house without the sound of his presence, though there was that the particular kind of silence a house has when someone who is always in it is suddenly not. She felt a different kind of quiet, the kind that arrives when pressure you have not been acknowledging suddenly lifts. She stood at the window for a moment after the carriage was gone and let herself feel it honestly. The house felt lighter, the day felt wider, she breathed differently. She noted this. She was not pleased by it in any simple way. She was honest enough to understand that what she was feeling was the relief of removing a weight she had been carrying without realizing it, the weight of constantly being in his space, of navigating every room in terms of where he was and was not, of holding her silence deliberately every time proximity required it. For 3 months she had been doing this with what she believed was ease. Now she understood that the ease had cost something, not much, but something. She went down to the morning room and asked for tea. The 4 days were different, better honestly, and she allowed herself to be honest. The house felt like hers in a way it had not before. She used rooms she did not usually use. She took her dinner in the morning room instead of the long dining room, at a round table near the window, with a good book propped against the bread basket, and she ate by herself in the most pleasant possible way. She walked the full perimeter of the estate grounds one afternoon, something she had not yet done, and it took 2 hours and left her pleasantly tired. She had tea with Clara one afternoon, spontaneously, in a way that would not have been natural with Edmund in the house, and they talked, not about anything important, but in the comfortable, easy way of 2 people who have been circling a genuine friendliness for a while and have finally stepped into it. She slept well all 4 nights. On the 4th night, the last one before his expected return, she sat at her writing desk later than usual. She had been reading and had not noticed the time, and when she finally looked up it was well past 11. The house was deeply quiet. The sky outside the east window was clear and cold, and she could see the stars with the particular sharpness they had on cold nights. She opened her journal. She wrote, "I know now what I am doing and why." She paused, then she wrote, "It is not about winning, it is about being real. I am real. He will understand that or he will not, but I already am it, regardless of whether he understands." She looked at that for a long moment. Then she wrote, "3 months done, I am well, I am more than well. I am more myself than I was, and the house knows it, and Oliver knows it, and Clara knows it, and somewhere, I think, even Edmund knows it, though he does not have words for it yet." She closed the journal. She went to bed. Edmund returned the next morning at 11. She was in the east garden with Oliver when she heard the carriage. She stayed in the garden. She had 3 more questions to ask Oliver about the spring planting, and she asked all 3 of them, clearly and without hurry, while the sound of the carriage settled in the drive and then went quiet. Oliver answered each question with his usual considered slowness. They walked to the far end of the new path together to look at how the stone was being set. She came in from the garden 40 minutes later with soil on her gardening gloves and a precise understanding of what she wanted to plant along the eastern wall in the spring. She passed through the entrance hall and went up to change. She did not look for Edmund. She did not listen for him. He was back. The house had resumed its previous arrangement. She resumed hers. At dinner that evening, across the long table, he looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. She met his look for the fraction of a second that was adequate and then attended to her food. The meal was good. The candles burned. The clock ticked. Outside, the November wind was coming up, and the trees were doing what trees do in November, letting go, steadily and without resistance, of everything they did not need for winter. She thought, eating her soup, which was warm this time, that she and this house and the garden and Clara and Oliver, and the woman in the corridor painting and the stars outside the east window were all, in their different ways, living evidence that things could continue beautifully without anyone's permission. She thought she had never been more certain of anything. The East Garden had become something. That was the only way to say it that felt true. By the 4th month, the East Garden had stopped being a project and had become a place, the way that places are different from projects because projects are things you work on and places are things you live in. Alara lived in the East Garden now. Not all day, not every day, but in the way that matters. She went there when she needed to think clearly, and the garden gave her clarity. She went there when she needed beauty, and the garden provided it. She went when she was low and left feeling more herself, which is what places do when they are truly yours. Oliver had done extraordinary work. She gave him full credit for it always in her own thoughts and whenever she spoke of it to anyone. He was the one who understood the soil, who knew which plants would anchor and which would spread and which needed coaxing and which needed to be left alone. He was the one who had suggested the silver ground cover and the stone path and the restructuring of the beds so that they received the morning light at the angle that would serve them best. He was a craftsman. She was a collaborator. Together they had built something that neither of them could have built alone. She spent mornings there when the weather permitted. She wore outdoor clothes, practical things, because she was not decorating the garden, she was working in it. She learned slowly the difference between plants that needed daily attention and plants that needed to be watched rather than touched. She learned about roots. Oliver taught her about roots, about how the real work happened underground, how the visible flourishing was always the last thing to arrive, long after the ground had been doing what it needed to do in its invisible way. She found this metaphor so fitting for so many things in her life that she wrote it in her journal and looked at it several times over the following weeks. Clara had become a friend. This had happened gradually over the 4 months, in the way that genuine friendships happen, not through any single decisive moment, but through the accumulation of small ones, each adding a small weight to something that eventually becomes solid enough to name. Clara was efficient and discreet, and had never once in 4 months said an unnecessary thing about the household or the people in it. She came every morning and managed Alara's needs with the kind of attention that did not announce itself. She noticed when Alara was tired and said nothing about it, but appeared with tea an hour earlier than usual. She noticed when Alara was in good spirits and allowed her own face to show a small, genuine smile in response. She was 20 years old and had grown up in the village that bordered the estate. Her mother was the woman who ran the post office. Her father worked one of the farms connected to the Harwick land. She had 3 younger brothers and a sister. She had gone into service at 18 because she was good at it, and because it offered her more of a life than the village alone could provide, which was not nothing but was also not everything. She wanted to see more. She wanted to know more. She was, Alara had come to understand, a person of genuine capability who was currently in a role that used only part of what she had. Ilara had started lending her books. This had begun quietly in the second month, when Clara had noticed a particular book on Ilara's writing desk, and had looked at it with an expression that was brief and professionally controlled but was, Ilara was sure, the expression of someone who had read the author before and was interested. Ilara had asked, without making it a large thing, whether she had read the author. Clara had said yes once some time ago. Ilara had offered the book when she finished it. Clara had taken it with the dignity of someone who understands that they are being treated as an equal and has decided to accept that gracefully. They had not made it into something official or discussed. Books moved from Ilara's desk to Clara's hands when Ilara was finished. Sometimes when she returned one, Clara said something brief about it, an observation, occasionally a question. The observations were always good. Ilara looked forward to them. In the fourth month, this had quietly expanded. One afternoon in the morning room, they had ended up sitting across from each other for 20 minutes talking about a novel they had both now read, with the focused pleasure of two people who are talking about something they both care about, and who have discovered, unexpectedly, that the other person is very good at caring about things. It was the longest conversation Ilara had with anyone inside Harwick Hall in 4 months. She had gone to the library afterward with a feeling in her chest that took her a moment to identify. It was the feeling of having been genuinely in conversation. She had not realized how much she had missed conversation until she had it. She wrote letters. She wrote to her mother and to Helen, and to 2 other people she was close to, a former schoolfellow named Nora who now lived abroad with her diplomat husband, and an older woman named Margaret, who had been a friend of Ilara's father and who sent letters that were equal parts wisdom and humor and always arrived at the right moment. She wrote long letters and received long letters back, and the letters were the current of something real in what might otherwise have been a rather contained life. The letters confirmed for her that the world outside Harwick Hall was still going on in its interesting and complicated way, that Nora was learning the local language wherever she was, that Helen had adopted a dog, that Margaret had opinions about 3 different books she had recently read and was prepared to argue all of them. She was not isolated. She refused to be isolated. She was also, in the 4th month, beginning to correspond with people she had not written to before. The redesign of the East Garden had led her, through Oliver, to a horticultural society whose newsletter she now received. One article in the newsletter had led her to write to its author, a woman named Dr. Frances Bright, who ran a botanical study at a university in the north. Dr. Bright had written back within a week, a long and enthusiastic letter about root systems and soil science that was one of the most interesting things Ilara had read in months. They had exchanged 3 letters since. Ilara was considering, very privately, whether she might pursue this kind of study more formally. She did not know yet, but she was considering. She was also, and this was the thing she held most carefully, the most private and most important thing, teaching herself to draw plants. She had a set of pencils and a sketchbook, bought with her own allowance, and she spent perhaps an hour each week making botanical drawings of things in the garden. They were not good, not yet. The proportions were sometimes wrong and the shading was flat, and she had no training in this kind of drawing. But she was getting better. She could see herself getting better. The 4th drawing of the silver ground cover near the oak was visibly better than the first one, and when she held them next to each other she could trace the line of improvement, which was one of the most satisfying things she had ever done. She did all of this, the garden, the letters, the books with Clara, the botanical drawings, the correspondence with Dr. Bright, inside the house of Edmund Harwick, Duke of Harwick, who had told her 4 months ago that conversation was not the point. He was wrong about almost everything, she thought, but the most wrong he had been was about the conversation. The conversation had not stopped. It had simply moved to places he could not see. It was happening in the morning room with Clara. It was happening in the East Garden with Oliver. It was happening on the pages of letters to her mother and Helen and Nora and Margaret and Dr. Frances Bright. It was happening in her journal every evening. It was happening in the botanical sketchbook with the pencils that were getting softer in her hand as she used them more. The conversation had not stopped. It had expanded. Edmund, meanwhile, had continued to exist in ways that she continued to notice without fully examining. He was in the breakfast room most mornings. He walked past the library in the evenings with decreasing consistency about stopping outside it. Sometimes he stopped, sometimes he did not, and she had stopped counting the seconds. The library books she noticed being shifted had expanded from the natural philosophy to something on land management, and a book she had left on the desk about a particular period of English history that she had found absorbing. He had also done something that she found, privately, arresting. He had bought flowers. This had been 3 weeks ago. She had come down one morning and found in the entrance hall a vase of winter flowers that had not been there before and that did not match the usual household arrangements. They were not formal flowers, not the kind the house usually kept for its public spaces. They were small and simple and looked as though they might have come from a market rather than a florist. She had asked Mrs. Tate about them because Mrs. Tate would know. Mrs. Tate had said, with the neutrality that was her highest social art, that the Duke had asked for them to be placed there. She had stood in the entrance hall and looked at the flowers. She had not named what she felt about this, not out loud, not to anyone. She had walked past them with the same composure she brought to everything in this house and gone to the library. She had sat in her chair by the window and opened a book and looked at the same page for quite a long time without reading a word on it. He had bought flowers. He had asked for them to be placed in the entrance hall. The entrance hall that she walked through every morning. She wrote that evening, "I do not know what he is doing, I am not sure he knows, but he is doing something." She had sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote, "He bought flowers." She closed the journal and sat in the dark room looking at the stars, which were very bright that night, cold and clear and impossibly far away and entirely indifferent to her, which was, she had long since decided, one of their most comforting qualities. The flowers stayed in the entrance hall for 6 days. When they began to fade, Mrs. Tate had them removed. 2 days after they were removed, there were new ones. She continued walking through the entrance hall every morning. She continued saying nothing. But something in the house had shifted again, slightly, like a large thing settling into a new position. She felt it in the way you feel a change of season, not all at once, but in a series of signs that accumulate until the change is undeniable. She was not softening, that was not what this was. She had not forgotten the dinner table or the words spoken there or what they had made clear. She was not going to wake up one morning and find she had forgotten. This was not a thing she would forget. But she was honest enough and careful enough to note that the person in this house who was changing was not her. She had been herself from the beginning. She was more herself now, if anything. The person who was changing was the man at the other end of the long table, the one who had arranged his morning schedule to be in the same room as her, who stopped in corridors outside rooms she was in, who read her books without asking, who bought flowers and placed them somewhere she would walk past every single day. She wrote a letter to her mother that afternoon. She wrote about the garden and Clara and Dr. Bright and the botanical drawings. At the end of the letter, without naming Edmund, without explaining anything, she wrote, "Something is growing here. I'm not sure what it is yet, but it has roots, and roots, as I have been learning, do their real work out of sight." She sealed the letter. She went to the morning room for tea. Outside, Oliver was in the east garden in his coat, moving slowly along the new beds, checking on things, making the small adjustments that were his version of conversation with the plants. She could see him from the morning room window. She watched him for a moment. Then she returned to her tea and her book, and the afternoon settled around her like something warm. In the 17th week, something happened at dinner that she had not planned for and could not have anticipated. There were no guests that evening. It was just the two of them at the long table, as usual in the candlelight, in the usual silence. The soup was clear broth with a garnish of winter herbs. The main course was a roast. Outside, rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the steady kind that settles in for the whole evening, and the windows were dark with it. Lara had been reading in the library late that afternoon, a long and involved passage in a book about cartography, maps, specifically old maps, the way early cartographers had drawn the parts of the world they did not know and had filled them with sea creatures or storm clouds, or simply left them blank with a notation that said in the Latin of the time, "Here is the unknown." She had thought about that, about the honesty of it. Here is the unknown, we are not pretending. We have drawn the edge of what we know, and beyond it, we are telling you that we genuinely do not know. She had been thinking about this at dinner, about edges and the unknown beyond them. Edmund set down his wine glass. He said, addressing the general air slightly in the direction of her side of the table, not quite at her but not away from her either, "The roof on the south barn will need to be replaced before spring." She looked at her food. He continued, "I am told the cost will be considerable. I believe Mrs. Tate has the estimate if you wish to see it." She did not respond. She ate her roast. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said more quietly in a different register, I have been told the garden looks very well. She lifted her glass and drank from it. He said nothing else. The dinner continued, the rain continued, the candles burned. She ate her dinner with full attention. But later at her writing desk she wrote, "He is trying to talk to me. He does not know how. He has possibly never known how. He is using the roof of the south barn because the roof of the south barn is the kind of thing he knows how to say." She sat looking at this for a long time. Then she wrote very slowly, "I do not know what to do with this yet." She looked at that sentence for longer than she had looked at anything in months. She felt the truth of it. She genuinely did not know. She was a person who generally knew what she thought, who could generally look at a situation and form a clear view. But this she could not yet see clearly. The man who had told her she existed for a single function was now mentioning the south barn roof and repeating that someone had told him her garden looked well. The man who had not asked her a single question about herself in 4 months was now sitting at the far end of the table, finding the edges of a language he did not have. She did not know what that was. She did not know if it was enough. She did not know if it mattered, or if it was too late to matter, or if there was a version of this story in which it mattered in the right way. She wrote, "I will think about this." Then she closed the journal and sat in the dark room for a very long time. The rain outside the east window did not stop. It came steadily and without drama, the way the best kind of rain does, not trying to be a storm, not announcing itself, just present and persistent and doing, with total commitment, the thing that rain is for. In the morning, the garden beds would be well watered. She found that she was glad of it. The 18th week, Oliver told her one morning with the quiet satisfaction of someone reporting something he had been watching for, that the silver plants near the oak had put down roots deep enough to be considered established. In the language of gardening, established meant that the risk of loss had passed, that the plant was now committed to the ground and the ground had accepted it, not thriving yet, not in bloom, but past the point of being removable. She knelt down and looked at the plants closely. They were low and silver and completely unassuming, doing nothing that anyone would notice from a distance. But they were there. They were not going anywhere. They had made their decision. Oliver stood beside her and said in his understated way, "There'll be something by spring." She stood up and brushed the soil from her gloves. She said, "Yes, I think they will." She looked at the plants for another moment, then she went inside. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in December. It came in the Morning Post, which Alara reviewed every day at the writing desk in the morning room with her second cup of tea. There were usually 5 or 6 letters, correspondence from the people she wrote to regularly, household business, the horticultural newsletter, occasional invitations to events in the county that she accepted or declined on her own judgment without consulting anyone. She managed her correspondence with the same organized attention she brought to the household and the garden, carefully, without drama, keeping what mattered and releasing what did not. The letter from Edmund was at the bottom of the pile. She knew it was from him before she opened it because she knew his handwriting from household documents she had seen. It was precise, controlled, the kind of handwriting that has been drilled into correctness and then hardened through decades of use into something absolutely consistent. Every letter formed the same way each time, no variation, no improvisation. She set it aside while she read the other letters. She did not do this for any strategic reason. She did it because she was not ready, and she thought it was better to be honest with herself about not being ready than to open something important before she was. She read Helen's letter, which was long and cheerful, and contained a description of the new dog that was extremely entertaining. She read a letter from the estate solicitor about a property matter she had been following. She read a brief note from Mrs. Tate about a household scheduling matter. She read the horticultural newsletter, which had an article about winter root work she read twice. Then she picked up Edmund's letter. She opened it with the small silver letter knife she kept on the desk. She unfolded the paper. It was one sheet, written on both sides in that precise handwriting. She read it. He had not written it like a business letter, though she could see the ghost of that instinct in it, the same directness, the same lack of preamble. But the content of it was not business. The content was, she realized slowly, an attempt at something quite different. He had written, "I am aware that we have not spoken since a certain evening in September. I am aware that this is a result of something I said at that dinner which I have since reconsidered. I am not skilled at these kinds of letters. I am better, as you may have observed, at letters concerning practical matters." But I am told that the practical approach to an impractical situation often makes the situation worse, so I am attempting something else. He wrote, I do not know you, I am aware of this. I am aware that this is more my fault than the general circumstances would suggest. I have been in this house a long time and I am accustomed to it working in a certain way, and I had assumed, incorrectly, that the way it worked would simply continue regardless of who was in it with me. I am beginning to understand that this was an error. He wrote, I have noticed that you read. I have noticed that you have improved the household in several ways that Mrs. Tate mentioned to me in her way, by reporting on them without my asking. I have noticed that the East Garden is, by all accounts, beautiful. I have not told you this, I am telling you now. He wrote, I do not expect a response. I am writing this because I believe it should be said, and I have discovered that the alternative, saying nothing, has a cost I had not anticipated. He wrote at the end, Edmund. She folded the letter and put it on the desk. She sat very still. She stayed still for quite a long time. The morning moved around her, sounds from the corridor, the footman's steps, the distant noise of household activity. The fire in the morning room was doing its usual good job. Outside the window, the December garden was bare and quiet, the way December gardens are, not dead but resting, storing what it would need for spring. She picked up the letter and read it again. The second reading gave her different things than the first. The first time she had read for content, what is he saying, what does he mean? The second time she read for the person writing it. She read for the places where his usual language, the precise and certain language of a man who had always been sure of where he stood, was slightly less certain, slightly less arranged. The phrase, I am not skilled at these kinds of letters, was honest in a way she had not expected from him. The phrase, I am told that the practical approach often makes things worse, she recognized as Frederick. This had Frederick's voice in it, or at least Frederick's influence. He had spoken to someone, he had taken advice from someone. This was not nothing. The phrase, I do not expect a response, she read 3 times. He was not demanding. He had, perhaps for the first time since she had known him, asked for nothing except to be heard. He had not concluded the letter with a request or an instruction or an expectation. He had said what he wanted to say and then stepped back from it. She set the letter on the desk. She did not write back that day. She had made the rule, she had made it for herself, it was her rule and she was not ready to change it. Not because she was being rigid, not because she was keeping score, but because she was a person who thought carefully before acting, and she had not yet finished thinking. She went to the library. She took the book she was currently reading, a collection of essays she had been working through slowly, 1 or 2 at a time, because they required thought rather than speed, and she sat in her chair by the south window and read 3 of them without stopping. She read the words carefully, and she also, in the parallel way of minds that cannot quite stop working even when directed elsewhere, thought about the letter. She thought about what it would mean to respond. She thought about what responding would change and what it would not change, and whether she was ready for the change. She thought about the dinner in September and the words spoken there, and whether a letter, even a good-faith letter, even a genuinely honest one, was equal to them. She thought about what was fair, and whether fair was even the right measure. She thought about what she wanted, which was the most important and also the most difficult question. She wanted to be known. She had always wanted this, in the basic way that all people want it, not as an ego need but as a real need, the need to be in a life where someone else's understanding of you is reasonably accurate. She had not been known in this house. She had been assumed. She had been categorized before she arrived and filed under a specific heading and left there. And she had built, in 4 months, an entire world inside this house that existed entirely without his knowledge, because he had not asked, because he had not looked, because he was a man who had never had to look. He had looked now, or he had tried to. The letter was the evidence. She thought about what it would mean to remain in the silence, to hold the original decision all the way to its full year, which was not something she had committed to consciously but had arrived at in her mind as a natural span. And she thought about what it would mean to step outside the silence before then, not in surrender, not in forgiveness of everything, but in what? In recognition, in a kind of honesty that matched his. She did not decide that day. She put the letter in the drawer of her writing desk, at the back, under some other papers. She did not place it prominently. She placed it where she would know it was there but would not have to see it every time she opened the drawer. The week continued. She went to the East Garden. She visited Clara. She wrote to Helen. She read. She drew 2 more botanical drawings, one of the winter rose hips that Oliver had told her to leave on the bushes because the birds depended on them, one of the bare oak which she was finding as interesting without its leaves as with them, the whole structure of it visible now, the pattern of branches that had been hidden. She passed Edmund 3 times in the house that week, once in the entrance hall, where the winter flowers were currently a cluster of deep red berries on branches she thought might be holly, once in the corridor near the library, once in the morning room, where he came in while she was there and paused and then turned and left again quietly without the awkwardness she might have expected. She noted all 3 encounters. She wrote about them that evening. He is giving me space. He is doing this deliberately. He came into the morning room and left again without forcing anything, and I noticed that, and the noticing of it did something I am not ready to name. She wrote, I think he is trying. She put the pen down. She sat with her hands folded and looked at those 4 words. Then she wrote, whether trying is enough is not a question I have to answer tonight. She closed the journal. In the morning she would go to the garden. Oliver had said the rose hips were at their best this week, before the birds found them all. She wanted to draw them in good light. She would think about the letter when she was ready to think about it. She was not there yet. But she was getting there. The unopened letter that she had told herself she was not going to keep on the desk was on the desk. She had moved it there on the 5th day because she needed to stop pretending she was not thinking about it and start thinking about it properly. She had placed it at the corner of the writing desk in full view, and she had looked at it frankly and said to herself, this is a letter. You do not have to respond to it, but you are going to think about it. She thought about it. She thought about the particular difficulty of the kind of man Edmund was not a bad man. She was increasingly sure of this, not a man who had been unkind at that dinner in September out of a desire to wound. He had been honest about something that other men in his position would have masked with pleasantries, and his honesty had been brutal because he had no idea it was brutality. He had said what he believed to be the plain truth of his situation, in the way that people who have never had to account for the effect of their words on other people say things plainly without knowing what plainness costs. This did not excuse him. She had already been through this thought, but she was more interested now in the 5th month in understanding him than in cataloguing his failures, because the cataloguing was a closed exercise and the understanding was not. She thought about what it had cost him to write that letter. She was not naive about this. She knew that some people write letters easily, that vulnerability on paper is easier than vulnerability in person, that the act of writing allows for the selection and arrangement that conversation does not. She did not believe he had dashed the letter off without effort. The places in it where his language lost its precision, the phrase I am not skilled at these kinds of letters, these were not performances. She had been watching Edmund Harwick with careful attention for 5 months, and she had a reasonable understanding of the difference between when he was performing and when he was not. He was almost always performing. The letter had places where he was not. She did not respond. She was still not responding. But she took the letter out of the drawer and put it on the desk, and she looked at it when she sat down to write her own letters, and she let herself know it was there. This was its own kind of response. She did not fool herself about that. On the 9th day after the letter arrived, Frederick came again. He had been coming more often than usual, and she had the growing suspicion, fond and not unkind, that he was keeping an eye on things. He had that quality of a person who cannot stop himself from caring about the people he cared about, even when caring required him to make 3-hour carriage journeys in December weather. She met him in the entrance hall, and he came in from the cold with red cheeks, and the particular pleased look of someone who has made a decision to do something and is glad they did. She took him to the morning room for tea. Edmund was informed of his arrival and came down from the study 20 minutes later, and the 3 of them had tea together, which was a kind of occasion that had not occurred before in Alara's time at Harwick Hall. Frederick asked about the garden. He asked about her correspondence with Dr. Bright, which she had mentioned in a letter she had written to him after their last visit. She had begun to write to Frederick, which felt natural and right. He asked about Clara and said he was glad she had good company. He asked about the botanical drawings, and when she told him she had been working on the rose hips, he said he had a particular interest in botanical illustration, and asked if he might see the drawings sometime, and she told him she would bring them to the next visit. Edmund sat with his tea and listened. He was not absent in the way he usually was, the way that felt like a wall with furniture in front of it. He was differently quiet this time. He was listening, she could feel it, in the real way, the way that is different from simply being in the room. At one point Frederick said to Edmund, You have a remarkable household here, you know. I think Ilara has made it considerably more alive than it has been." Edmund looked at his tea. He said, "Yes." One word. But the word was not automatic. It came after a pause of the specific kind that means something was considered before being said. She did not acknowledge this. She did not look at him. But she heard it the way she heard everything in this house, clearly and with her full attention. Later, after dinner, Frederick found a moment with her in the corridor on his way to the guest room. He stopped and looked at her with the kind expression that was one of the things she found most genuinely likable about him. He said, "He wrote you a letter, I think." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "You told him too." Frederick smiled. He said, "I suggested that putting things in writing could be useful. What he wrote was entirely his own." She considered this. Then she said, "It was a reasonable letter." Frederick nodded. He did not push it further. This was one of his best qualities, knowing exactly where the edge of something was and not going past it. He said good night and went to his room. She went to her desk. She looked at the letter. She picked up her pen. She held it for a moment over a blank piece of paper, not yet touching it. Then she put the pen down. Not yet, she was not there yet, but she was closer than she had been. The distance between where she was and the moment when she would be ready to respond had been shrinking, quietly, daily, the way the distance always shrinks between where you are and where you are going when you are genuinely moving toward something. She looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she placed one hand on top of it, briefly, the way you touch something you intend to return to. She went to bed. Outside, the December night was very cold and very clear. The east garden was bare and still, all root and soil and waiting, everything of importance happening underground, out of sight, preparing for something that would not be visible until the ground decided it was ready. It was not ready yet, but it was getting there. Frederick left the next morning after breakfast. She walked him to the door. Edmund appeared from the direction of his study and shook Frederick's hand. There was a moment, just a moment, not long, not significant unless you were paying the particular kind of attention Ilara was paying, when Edmund glanced at her briefly while Frederick was speaking. Not a glance that demanded anything, just a glance that checked, that confirmed, that did the small work of acknowledging without making it into a declaration that she was there. She met his eyes for a fraction of a second, then she looked back at Frederick. The carriage took Frederick away. Edmund went back to his study. She went to the morning room. Clara appeared with tea and a small plate of the almond biscuits that the kitchen made when the weather was cold because someone, long before any of them were here, had decided that this was what you did in December, and the house had been doing it ever since. She sat with her tea and her biscuits and thought about the letter and Frederick and the fraction of a second in the entrance hall. She wrote one sentence in her journal that afternoon, "I am nearly ready." She closed it. She went to the library. She had a great deal of reading still to do. January came without ceremony. The first morning of it was gray and still, the kind of morning that makes no promises. Ilara stood at the east window in her room before Clara arrived and looked out at the garden, which was under a thin covering of frost that made everything look both smaller and more precise, as if the cold had drawn the outline of each plant and branch with a careful hand and told it to stay exactly there until further notice. She had been at Harwick Hall for 8 months. She thought about that number as she stood at the window. 8 months. She had been a married woman in this house for 8 months, and in that time she searched for the word and found it without much difficulty, substantial. That was the word. She had become substantial in a way she had not been when she arrived, not louder. Not more certain in the performative sense that some people meant when they said that about a person, but more real, more fully herself, more occupying the exact space she was supposed to occupy, rather than the smaller or different space that circumstances or other people's definitions tried to put her in. The frost was already beginning to lift in the places where the early light was reaching. She watched it go. This was one of her quiet pleasures which she had not known about until she came here and started actually looking at mornings, the way frost does not melt all at once but retreats slowly from the warmth outward. The places in shadow stayed frosted longest, the places in light let go first. She thought about the letter. She thought about it every day now, which was not the same as thinking about it constantly. She had a full life that occupied her fully, but it was a steady presence in her days, the way an unanswered question is present even when you are not actively turning it over. She had made no decision. She had not told herself she would respond by a certain date or had to do something by a certain point. She was waiting, with the patience that had become one of her deepest-built qualities over these months, for the internal readiness that she knew would come and had not yet arrived. Clara came in. They went about the morning. Ilara dressed carefully, as she always did, not because she was performing for anyone, but because it was part of how she organized herself, the external arrangement that helped settle the internal one. She went down to breakfast. Edmund was there. He had been at breakfast every morning since October. This was no longer remarkable, it was simply the current pattern of the household, like the kitchen making almond biscuits in cold weather. He was at the sideboard with his coffee and his newspaper. She took her plate and went to her place at the table. The footman brought tea. Clara had communicated to the kitchen, as she always did, what the Duchess would be eating that morning, and it arrived correctly and without fuss. They ate in silence. But the silence in January was not the same silence as the silence in September. She had been thinking about this. She had written about it in her journal several times, trying to get at what was different, because something was different and she wanted to understand it with precision. In September, the silence had been the silence of two strangers who had been put together by arrangement and had no language for each other and were not looking for one. In January, the silence was the silence of two people who were aware of each other. Not comfortable, not easy, not warm in any obvious sense, but aware. He knew she was in the room, she knew he was in the room. The awareness was a kind of presence, and presence was not nothing. She finished her breakfast and stood. As she gathered herself to leave, Edmund said, without looking up from his newspaper, "The solicitor is coming Thursday about the North property. It would be useful if you were present." She paused, she looked at him. He said, still looking at the newspaper, "The North property is adjacent to the land you are redesigning. Some of the boundary questions involve the east access. You would understand the relevant details better than I do." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "What time on Thursday?" It was the first sentence. She had spoken directly to him since September. The room did not change, the footman's face did not change, the newspaper did not change, the breakfast things on the table did not change. Nothing in the room changed in any way that anyone watching would have been able to point to. But something happened. Edmund looked up from the newspaper. He looked at her, properly, for the first time in months, the direct attention that she had not received from him since the dinner in September, and which she now received steadily without looking away, because she was not going to look away. He said, 10 o'clock. She said, "I will be there." She left the breakfast room. In the corridor she walked at her normal pace. She went upstairs to her room where Clara was making the bed, and she said she needed a moment, and Clara said of course and left. She stood in the middle of her room in the winter morning light, and let herself feel what had just happened fully, without managing it. She had spoken to him. She had not planned it. She had not woken up that morning and decided today is the day. She had simply been in the room and the conditions had been right, and she had responded with the honest directness that was most naturally hers. The question of being present for the solicitor was a genuine question. He was right that the east garden and the north property boundary were connected, and she did know the relevant details. It was a legitimate reason to ask. And she had answered it. She sat on the edge of the bed. She felt the bed's firmness under her. She looked at the east window, which was clear of frost now, the glass clean and bright, the garden visible in full morning light. She thought that was the right moment. She had not told herself a year was the absolute rule. She had not made a vow that was going to outlast the reason for it. She had made a decision that served a purpose, and the purpose had been served. She was not the same woman who had sat at the dinner table in September and heard herself defined by a single sentence. She was a woman who had spent 8 months becoming so fully herself that no single sentence, however brutal, could have defined her anymore. She had built a world. She had found her ground. She had proven to herself in every way that mattered that she was not reducible. She was not doing this because he had bought flowers or because he had stopped in corridors. She was not doing this because his letter had moved her, though it had moved her. She was doing this because she was ready, and readiness was the only valid reason she had ever been waiting for. Thursday at 10 o'clock was 2 days away. She went to the library. The solicitor's name was Mr. Gregory, a precise and experienced man in his 60s who had handled Harwick estate matters for over 2 decades, and who was, Alara noticed when he arrived Thursday morning, the kind of professional who could read a room in 30 seconds and then behave in the way that would make the room most productive. He read the room in roughly 15 seconds, she estimated, and then proceeded with the polished neutrality of someone who had seen many kinds of rooms and had learned to serve the task regardless of the atmosphere around it. The meeting was in Edmund's study. Alara sat in the chair to the left of the desk. Mr. Gregory sat across from Edmund. The maps were spread on the study table. The North property boundary discussion was detailed and specific, involving boundary lines and access rights and a fence that had been in the wrong position for longer than any of the people in the room had been alive. Alara listened. She asked 2 questions. Both were good questions, she could tell, because Mr. Gregory answered them with more engagement than he had been using for the routine business, and because Edmund, she noticed in the side of her vision, looked at her when she asked them. The meeting lasted an hour and 15 minutes. At the end of it, there was a moment while Mr. Gregory was gathering his papers when Edmund said, across the table, "The Eastern Access situation, is that how you understood it?" He was talking to her, directly to her. He was asking her a specific question that had a specific answer that he genuinely wanted. She said, "Yes, and I think the fence relocation Mr. Gregory suggested is the right one. It will also work better for the garden path, which would otherwise cut close to the old boundary." Mr. Gregory noted this. Edmund said with a brief nod, "Agreed." That was all, but it was real. It was functional, a real exchange between 2 people about something that mattered, and the ease of it, not the warmth, not the trust that is built slowly over different kinds of time, but the simple, actual ease of 2 people having a genuine conversation. That ease existed in the room briefly, and she felt it, and she thought he felt it too. After Mr. Gregory left, they were briefly alone in the study. This was the first time she had been alone in a room with Edmund since she had started speaking again, and it had a weight to it that she was not going to pretend she did not feel. She gathered her notes from the meeting. She had taken notes, with the small leather journal she carried in her pocket, and stood. Edmund said, "Thank you for being here, it was useful." She looked at him. She said, "It was. Good morning." She left the study. She went to the morning room. She sat down and looked at the winter garden outside the window for quite some time. The frost from 2 days ago was gone. The beds were quiet and brown and entirely committed to what was happening underground. Oliver had told her last week that the bulbs she had planted in October were down there, doing their invisible preparation, and that in a few months the evidence of that preparation would be visible. She thought about that. She thought about the particular faith it required to put something in the ground in the cold months, and believe, without being able to see it, that something was happening. She had been practicing that faith for 8 months. She wrote in her journal that evening, longer than usual. She wrote about the meeting and Mr. Gregory and the boundary line and the moment in the study when Edmund had asked her question and her answer had been right, and they had simply been 2 people in a room working out a problem together. She wrote about what that had felt like. She was honest about it. It had felt good, not reconciled, not resolved, not the kind of good that comes at the end of something. The kind of good that comes at the beginning of something that might be different from what came before. She wrote, "I have been the roots. I am beginning to think about being the flower." She looked at that sentence, then she wrote, "Not yet, but soon." She put down the pen. Outside, the January night settled over the garden. Inside, somewhere on the other side of the house, a light was on in Edmund's study. It had been on at this hour every night since September. She did not think about it the way she had in the beginning. It was simply part of the house now, like the clock in the dining room and the particular groan of the 3rd stair and the sound the east window made on windy nights. It was the evidence of a person living in a house, being present, being there. She went to bed. She slept with the particular depth and ease of someone who has done something honest in a day that required honesty and is now resting on the right side of it. In the morning, she would go to the east garden. There were things to check on. Oliver had mentioned the bulb beds. She wanted to see them even though there was nothing yet to see. She wanted to stand above them and know what was happening underneath and believe in it. She was very good at believing in things that were not yet visible. She had been practicing for 8 months. The days after Thursday were different. Not dramatically different. She was not a woman who moved dramatically, and she was not going to start now. But the texture of the days had changed in a way she could feel clearly, like the difference between walking on stone and walking on packed earth, both solid, both reliable but different underfoot. She spoke to Edmund when they were in the same room. Not at length, not yet, not with any of the warmth that genuine conversation requires and that she was not ready to supply without knowing it was genuine rather than performed. But she answered when he spoke. She asked once when she saw him in the corridor a brief question about a household matter she had needed his input on. He answered directly. She thanked him. They went their separate ways. Clara noticed. Of course she did. She said nothing about it, which was exactly the right response. But something in Clara's face was, very slightly, less cautious than it had been, as if she had been holding a breath for months without knowing it and had now quietly let it go. Mrs. Tate also noticed. Mrs. Tate demonstrated her noticing by being 3% more communicative in her daily briefings with Alara, which was, from Mrs. Tate, equivalent to another person writing a letter of congratulations. Oliver said nothing, because Oliver never said anything about anything that was not connected to the plants. But the morning after the Thursday meeting, he had brought her the first sketch of the spring planting plan, which he had been working on quietly for weeks and had not shown her before. He spread it on the garden table in the morning room, and explained it to her for 45 minutes with a thoroughness that felt, from Oliver, like a gift. She studied it with him with full attention, and found 3 places where she wanted to adjust, and 3 more where his instinct was better than hers would have been. They argued pleasantly about 2 of the adjustments, in the way that collaborators who respect each other argue, specifically without ego, oriented entirely toward the question of what would be best for the garden. It was one of the finest conversations she had in January. Edmund found her in the morning room afterward, when Oliver had gone and the plans were still spread on the table, and she was looking at the full design with the quiet pleasure of someone seeing something they had imagined beginning to take its concrete shape. He came to the doorway and looked at the plans. She did not move the plans or put them away or explain herself. She simply let him look. He came to the table. He looked at the design properly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The south section, is that a change from what you had originally planned?" She said, "Yes. Oliver thought the original plan would put too much shade on the early beds. This works better." He looked at the south section. He said he was right. She said he usually is. Edmund almost smiled. She saw it happen at the edge of his mouth before he managed it, not quite a smile, not yet something she would have called a smile, but the place just before one. He looked at the plans for another moment, then straightened. He said, "It will be very good." She said, "Yes, I think it will." He left. She looked at the doorway he had left through. Then she looked at the plans. Then she went back to studying them, which was what she had been doing before, and which she found just as satisfying as she had before. But she was smiling just slightly at the corner of her own mouth, the same almost place as his. She filed this privately in the part of her that kept everything carefully, and went back to the spring plans. The bulb beds were going to be extraordinary. She was sure of it. She wrote to Dr. Bright that afternoon, a long letter about a question she had been developing regarding the relationship between soil depth and root system complexity, which Dr. Bright had mentioned in her last letter, and which Alara had been thinking about since. The letter took 2 hours to write well, and she was pleased with it when she was done. It was the letter of someone who had genuinely engaged with the question and had something real to contribute. She also wrote to her mother. She wrote the longest letter she had written in months. She wrote about the East Garden and the spring plans and Clara and Oliver and the Horticultural Society and Dr. Bright. She wrote about the botanical drawings, 3 of which she now felt good enough to include, enclosed with the letter. She wrote about the solicitor meeting and the North property. She wrote near the end, without drama, without building to it, "Edmund and I have been finding our way toward a conversation. It is slow, but it is happening. I am well. I am better than well. I know who I am in this house now, and I did not when I arrived, and that makes everything else possible." She looked at that paragraph. It was honest. All of it was true. She sealed the letter. The month moved. February came with wind, and then, unexpectedly, with a week of brightness. The kind of February week that arrives like a mistake and feels like a promise. The frost burned off, and the garden had a quality in the late mornings that made her catch her breath on the way from the east door. A fresh, alive quality, like the ground was beginning to think about waking up. Oliver was in the garden every morning that week. He was not hurrying anything. He was watching. That was most of what good gardening was. He had told her once, watching, and knowing when to wait and when to act, and understanding that the difference between those 2 things was not always obvious but was always consequential. She watched too. She was watching everything now with the particular quality of attention she had been developing over 8 months in this house. Not the anxious attention of someone managing a difficult situation, but the interested attention of someone who is genuinely present in their own life and finds it, on balance, interesting. It was interesting, even the strange and complicated navigation of a marriage that had begun in the worst possible way and was now doing something else, something she did not yet have the full word for. It was interesting. She was interested in it. She thought Edmund was also interested in it. This was a new thought and she held it carefully, but she thought it was true. She thought that something in him had also shifted, and that the shift was not manufactured or performed. It was the shift of a person who has genuinely encountered something they did not expect, which was to say, a person who has been surprised into actually looking. He was looking now. She was not sure yet what she wanted him to see. She was still working that out. But the looking itself was different from the not looking, and different was, after 8 months of careful and deliberate and often lonely navigation, something she was allowed to acknowledge. She was allowed to be glad of things that were good. The East Garden in the February brightness was something she was glad of. The conversations with Clara, which had continued and deepened, were something she was glad of. The letters from Dr. Bright and Helen and her mother and Margaret and Nora were something she was glad of. The botanical drawings, of which there were now 12 and which were improving in ways she could measure, were something she was glad of. And she admitted to herself on a bright February morning while standing above the bulb beds where nothing was yet visible but something was most certainly happening. The fact that her husband had bought flowers for the entrance hall and put them there for her to walk past, and had written a letter that was honest about things he was not good at, and had come to the morning room table to look at the garden plans, and had said the words "it will be very good," this was also something she was glad of. Quietly, without any decisions yet about what it meant or where it led. Just glad. Oliver came to stand beside her above the bulb beds. He looked at the earth for a long moment in the way that he looked at things. Then he said, 2 more weeks, maybe 3, then you'll see the first ones. She said, what will come first? He said, the small white ones, near the path, they always come first. She looked at the earth, which showed nothing of its intentions. She said, I can wait. Oliver nodded, as if this were a perfectly adequate response to a perfectly reasonable situation, which it was. They went their separate ways. She went inside. She went to the library. She opened a book she had been saving for exactly this kind of bright, almost spring morning, and she began to read. Her mother's letter arrived on a Thursday in February, and Alara read it 3 times. The first time she read it quickly, the way you read a letter from someone you love and have been waiting to hear from, scanning for the essential things, health, news, mood, before going back to read it properly. The second time she read it slowly, taking in each paragraph with the attention it deserved. The third time she read one specific paragraph, which she will return to shortly, and she did not read it quickly or slowly but simply looked at it, the way you look at something that needs to be understood before you can move past it. Harriet had written, I received your drawings, my love, and they are extraordinary, not because they are technically perfect, because the proportions in the third one still want some adjustment, which I think you know, but because they are alive. That is the word. They have the quality of having been drawn by someone paying genuine attention to the thing they were drawing, and genuine attention is what makes the difference between a drawing and a record. You have always paid genuine attention to things. You have done it since you were small. I only hope that the life you are in is giving you enough beautiful things to pay attention to. She read that paragraph for the 3rd time and felt the full weight of what her mother had said without saying. I only hope the life you are in is giving you enough beautiful things to pay attention to. Harriet never wrote anything she did not mean, and she never wrote anything in an indirect way unless she was being careful about something. The careful thing she was being careful about was this. She was asking whether Alara was all right. Not in the basic sense her letters had been enough for Harriet to know she was all right in the basic sense. She was asking in the deeper sense, the sense that only mothers and very close friends ask in, the sense that means, is the shape of your life right? Is there enough in it? Is the person you are becoming the person you want to become? Alara sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She thought about what the honest answer was. Not the answer she would give in a letter, which would be selected and shaped and presented in the best way, but the raw, private answer, the one she would write in her journal rather than to anyone else. The answer was, yes, in ways I did not anticipate and could not have described before I was in them. She was surprised by this. She had the honesty to be surprised by it rather than claim she had known all along. When she had arrived at Harwick Hall 8 months ago, she had not believed that this house would become hers in the way it had. She had believed she would survive it, manage it, find her footing in it. She had not believed she would find it genuinely interesting, genuinely rich, in ways that had nothing to do with its grand scale or its library or its title. The richness she had found was not the richness the house had been designed to provide. It was the richness she had made herself, inside the walls, out of what was available. The garden, Clara, Oliver, the books, the letters, the drawings, Dr. Bright, the horticultural society, the woman in the corridor painting, the small white flowers that were going to come first, Oliver had said near the path in 2 or 3 weeks. And the thing that was beginning with Edmund, which she still did not have a full name for but which she was no longer refusing to acknowledge. She wrote back to her mother that afternoon. She wrote honestly, more honestly than she had been in previous letters, because her mother had asked an honest question and deserved an honest answer. She wrote, "I think it is. The life is giving me beautiful things, not the ones I expected, not in the ways I expected, but real ones. The garden is one of the most real things I have done. The drawings are the most surprised I have ever been by my own capability. I did not know I could do this. And something is happening between Edmund and me that I cannot yet describe fully, but which is not nothing. It is something. It is the beginning of something that I did not believe was possible in September, and have not stopped being surprised by since." She sealed the letter. She went to the garden. Oliver was not there that afternoon. He had taken one of his regular days at his own home in the village, where his wife grew vegetables in a kitchen garden that he described with the same respectful attention he gave the Harwick grounds. She walked the east path alone. The path was fully complete now, the stones set correctly and the edges defined. She walked it slowly from the old oak to the southern corner and back, and noticed each bed as she passed, the winter roses with their hips. The silver ground cover, deep-rooted and exactly as settled as Oliver had said it would be. The cleared space that was going to be the centerpiece bed in spring, currently bare but full of what was underneath. She stood at the end of the path near the oak and looked back at the whole garden. It was hers, not in any legal or formal sense. The east garden of Harwick Hall belonged to the estate, as everything at Harwick Hall belonged to the estate, and the estate was Edmund's by title and law and generations of inheritance. None of that was hers, and she had no expectation of it being hers. But the garden was hers in the way that matters, the way of genuine authorship. She had imagined it, planned it, worked it, learned from it, grown alongside it. It bore the evidence of her attention. It would continue to bear that evidence every spring for years after this one. She thought about her father saying that knowledge was the most honest thing a person could own. She added privately, and gardens. She went inside when the light began to change. She was passing through the entrance hall, gloves in hand, when Edmund appeared at the far end of it, coming from the direction of his study. He was in his coat, which meant he had been outside the stables, probably where she knew he spent time. His hair was wind-touched in a way it never was when he was inside the house, and it gave him briefly a different look, less arranged, less the portrait version of himself. She said, "Good afternoon." He said, "Good afternoon," and then, after the very smallest pause, "How is the garden?" She said, "Coming along. Oliver says the bulbs are 3 weeks out, maybe 2. He said, I look forward to seeing them." She nodded and moved toward the stairs. He said, as she was at the bottom step, "The spring plans, the design Oliver brought. Is it finished, or are you still adjusting?" She turned. She said, "Mostly finished. There are 2 beds I haven't decided on yet, the ones along the north face of the eastern wall." He said, "I know those beds. They were poorly managed for a long time. There was something, I don't remember what, that used to grow there when I was young, something blue." She looked at him. She said, "Do you remember what kind?" He thought for a moment. He said, "I don't, but it came every year. Whatever it was, it liked that wall." She said, "I'll ask Oliver, he might know." Edmund nodded. He said, "It might be worth finding out." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at her with the directness that was always his, but which now had something different behind it, or had always had something different behind it, and she was only now close enough to see it. She was not sure which. She said, "I'll let you know what he finds." She went upstairs. In her room she sat at the writing desk. She did not open the journal. She sat with her hands on the desk surface and thought about the entrance hall and the garden and the blue flowers that Edmund remembered from when he was young. She thought about the fact that he had said that he had offered it freely without being prompted, a small thing from his own memory, something that was not practical and was not business and was simply himself, briefly less arranged. She wrote, he remembered something blue. She wrote, he said he looked forward to seeing the bulbs. She looked at those two sentences for a while, then she wrote, I believe him. This was the thing that surprised her. She believed him, not because she had decided to trust him without evidence, not because she was hoping rather than thinking, because the evidence she had been carefully and honestly collecting for months was pointing in a direction she now felt she could follow without lying to herself about where she was going. He was different from September. She was different from September, and the difference was not merely the passage of time or the wearing down of resistance. It was the result of specific things that had happened, things she had done and choices she had made, and a garden that had grown and a letter written in the kind of honesty that cannot be performed convincingly over time. She was 30 days approximately from the year mark, 1 year of marriage, not 1 year of silence. She had broken the silence in January, and it had been the right thing at the right time and she stood by it. But 1 year of marriage, which was enough time to know some things and still be at the beginning of others. She wrote, I have been thinking about what I want. She sat with this for a moment, then she wrote it out. I want a life that is genuinely mine. I have that now inside this house more fully than I would have believed possible in September. I want work that uses what I actually am, my mind, my attention, my capacity to understand and grow things and build things. I am beginning to have that through the garden and the drawings and Dr. Bright and the letters and Clara. I want to be known by the people I live alongside. I am known by Clara and Oliver and in his way Mrs. Tate, and at a distance of many miles my mother and Helen and Nora and Margaret. I want eventually to be known by my husband. I do not know yet what that will look like or how long it will take, but I believe it is possible. I would not have said that in September. She put down the pen. She looked at what she had written for a long moment. Then she wrote at the bottom, I came to this house not knowing what I was walking into. I thought I was prepared and I was not. I thought I knew what I wanted and I only partly did. I thought the silence would be hard and it was not hard, not in the way I expected. It was a kind of work, useful work, the kind that shows you what you are made of. She wrote, I know what I am made of now. She closed the journal. The desk in front of her was tidy. The window to the east was beginning to go dark, the February afternoon closing over the garden. She could not see the bulb beds from here, but she knew they were there. She knew what was happening under the ground. She went down to dinner. Edmund was already at the table. The candles were lit. This was the same table it had always been, the same mahogany, the same candles, the same chandelier and the same silver and the same flower arrangement that Mrs. Tate organized with precise consistency. But she sat at the far end of it and looked down its length, and the table did not feel the same as it had in September. It was the same table. She was not the same person. He looked up when she came in. He said, Good evening. She said, Good evening. She sat down. The footman brought the soup. It was warm. They ate in a silence that was not a wall but a space, the way silence between two people who are comfortable in the same room can be a space rather than a barrier. Not comfortable yet, not fully, she was not going to rush that or pretend it, but real. Something real was present in the room between them. She felt it the way she felt the attention that day in the East Garden when he had said the plans would be very good. A presence that was specific to him, recognizable his. He said partway through the main course, Did you finish your letter to your mother today? I saw you had been writing. She looked at him. She said, Yes, I enclosed some of the botanical drawings. He said, The rose hips or the oak? She paused. She said, Both, and the ground cover from near the oak. He nodded. He said, Oliver told me about the drawings. He said they were accurate. From Oliver she knew that was genuine praise. She said, He told me the proportions are still not quite right in some of them. Edmund said, That will come. She looked at him. She said, Yes, I think it will. She went back to her food. The dinner continued. The candles burned. The room was quiet in its usual way. But the quiet had a different texture this evening, not the absence of something, but the presence of something small and real that was being given room, carefully by both of them, without any agreement between them about what it was or where it was going. She thought that was probably how most real things began, not with declarations, with room. After dinner she went to the corridor with the paintings. She stopped at the woman with the settled expression. She looked at her. The woman looked back with that face that was neither sad nor proud but decided, as it had always been. She had always thought this woman's expression was about having made her peace with difficulty. She understood now that it was something different. It was the expression of someone who had built something inside a difficult situation and was looking at it, not at the situation, but at what she had built, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows that what they made is real and will last. Ilara looked at her for a long moment, then she went to her room. She did not write in the journal. She had written enough today. She went to the window and looked at the east garden in the night, dark and quiet and entirely full of what it was preparing. Oliver had said 2 weeks, maybe 3. She could wait. The blue flowers were the thing that changed everything. Not the blue flowers themselves, the discovery of what they were, but the manner of the discovering. Oliver had thought about it for 3 days after she told him what Edmund had said. He had gone through his records, which were kept in a worn leather notebook that was half his own notes and half inherited knowledge from the man who had been head groundskeeper before him. On the 4th day he came to her in the morning room with the notebook and showed her an entry from 22 years earlier that said, in the handwriting of a man she had never met, the east wall beds, north face Campanula latifolia, planted by the late Duchess on instructions of the young lord aged 8, remove if they spread beyond the border. She looked at the entry, then she looked at Oliver. He said without expression because Oliver always said things without expression, "Bell flowers, deep blue, they'll still be in the ground if they weren't dug out." She said, "Were they dug out?" He said, "I don't think so, nobody thought to tell me to." She said, "Can they be brought back?" He said, "If they're there, they'll come back on their own when they're ready. They come back from root, it's what that kind of plant does." She sat with that for a long moment. She said, "Thank you, Oliver." He nodded and left. She sat in the morning room for a while. She thought about Edmund at 8 years old telling someone, his mother perhaps, or the previous gardener, that he wanted blue flowers planted on the north face of the eastern wall. And then the flowers coming every year, as he had said reliably, until he grew up and moved deeper into the house and the world of titles and estates, and the particular pressure of being the person everything depended on. And then, somewhere in there, the flowers stopping or being forgotten, or just not being noticed anymore. And the roots staying in the ground, doing what roots did, waiting for someone to clear the ground above them. She went to find Edmund. She did not find him immediately. He was in the stables as she had expected. She went to the stable yard and waited until she could see him through the stable door, attending to one of the horses. She said his name. He looked up. She said Oliver found the entry in the groundskeeper's record, the flowers from the north wall beds, their Campanula latifolia, bell flowers, deep blue, they were planted 22 years ago. He was still for a moment. She could not see his face fully in the stable shadow, but she saw the stillness. He said, "I remember." She said, "Oliver thinks the roots may still be in the ground. He says they come back from root. If we lave those beds clear and give them spring light, we may see them again this year." Edmund came to the stable door. He stood in the light. He looked at her. He said, "My mother planted them, because I asked her to." She said, "Oliver's record says that." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I had forgotten about the flowers themselves. I remembered the color." She said, "That's worth remembering." He looked at her with the same directness he always had, but the quality of it had changed in a way she could not yet name, had been changing for weeks, she realized, by degrees so small she had only noticed them accumulating and not the accumulation itself until this moment. He was looking at her with something in it that was not the flat certainty of the man at the September dinner. It was more uncertain than that, which was to say it was more real. He said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "It's your garden too." She left him at the stable door and went back to the house. In the kitchen corridor she passed one of the junior kitchen staff, a cheerful girl named Dot who was carrying a tray, and who said good afternoon with the bright directness of someone who has not been in service long enough yet to have learned to be invisible. Ilara said good afternoon back, warmly, and Dot went past. Ilara continued toward the stairs. She felt something in her chest that was not quite sad and not quite glad, but lived in the same neighborhood as both of them. She felt the particular combination of tenderness and sorrow that comes when you understand something about another person that they have not told you, but that explains them. She felt it for an 8-year-old boy who had wanted blue flowers on a wall and whose mother had planted them for him, and who had grown up into a man who remembered the color even when he had forgotten the flowers. She did not make the feeling into more than it was. She did not decide on the basis of it. She filed it in the place where she kept everything she was still thinking about, and she went upstairs. But something had shifted, the way things shift when a specific piece of information arrives that reorganizes everything around it. She understood Edmund a little better than she had this morning. She had the honesty to acknowledge that understanding a person was not the same as forgiving them, that it did not cancel the dinner in September or the months of being unlooked at or the reduction to a function. She knew all of that. She was not naive about any of it. But she was also honest enough to know that the person who planted blue flowers at age 8, who carried the memory of a color for 22 years, who grew up and became difficult and rigid and certain and lonely in the way that very specific kinds of people become lonely, that person was real. That person was there underneath the Duke, underneath the title, underneath the certainty that had been his armor for so long he had mistaken it for his actual self. She had thought in September that she was dealing with a wall. She had been right about the wall. She had been wrong about what was behind it. She wrote that evening, there was a boy who wanted blue flowers. Then, I think I am beginning to know who I am living with. Then, and she surprised herself with this sentence, she wrote, I think I might like him if we are careful. She sat with that for quite a long time. Outside in the east garden, in the north face beds that she had left clear and open to the coming spring light, something was in the ground that had been there for 22 years, doing the slow, invisible work of roots that intend to return. Oliver had said, they come back from root, it's what that kind of plant does. She had believed him immediately. She believed him still. The small white flowers came first, as Oliver had said they would. She saw them on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of March, while she was on her way to the east garden and had not yet reached it. She could see them from the garden door, the first small cluster of them along the path edge, so low to the ground they were barely visible, just a few points of white against the brown earth that had been bare and patient for months. She stood at the garden door for a moment. She felt the morning light on her face, which was the late winter light that had begun in the past 2 weeks to carry an actual warmth again, not much, not yet the warmth of April, but a warmth that had a future in it. She stood and looked at the white flowers and felt something open in her chest, the way doors open in spring, not dramatically, just with the natural ease of something that has been waiting for exactly this moment, and now that the moment has arrived finds it effortless. She went to them. She knelt on the path beside them and looked at them closely, the way she had learned to look at things in these months, with full attention, with the kind of looking that does not try to make the thing into something else but simply receives what it is. The flowers were small and white and perfectly formed and entirely themselves. They were not trying to be impressive. They were simply what they were, the first thing, the thing that came before everything else came, the announcement. She stayed there for a while. Oliver appeared eventually from the direction of the tool shed, and she looked up, and he looked at the flowers with the expression he had when things did the thing he had expected them to do. He said, there they are. She said, there they are. He said, 3 days, 4 days, you'll have color. She stood up and brushed her hands. She said, thank you, Oliver, for all of it. He accepted this with his usual quiet dignity. He said, good garden, it did most of the work itself. She thought about this later. She thought it was probably true of most things. The following days were full. The garden was coming alive with visible speed now, the way things do in spring when the soil has been well prepared. Things emerged that she had planted, and things emerged that she had not planted, bulbs and shoots, and the first unfurling of green from places that had seemed entirely committed to brown right up until they were not. She was in the garden every morning. She made botanical drawings of the new things as they appeared. She wrote to Dr. Bright with detailed observations that Dr. Bright responded to with 3 times as many questions as observations, which was the particular quality of an excellent researcher, always finding more to know in the things you thought you already knew. She wrote to her mother. She wrote to Helen, who had named the dog a name that made Alara laugh when she read it. She wrote to Nora and to Margaret, and she received letters back from all of them, and the letters were the ongoing evidence of a life lived in full connection with the people who mattered to her. Edmund came to the garden on the 4th day, when Oliver had said there would be color. She was at the south bed, checking the progress of something she had been monitoring, when she heard his steps on the stone path. She looked up. He was walking along the east path in his coat, looking at the beds on either side with the expression she had learned over these months to read as genuine engagement rather than assessment. He was looking at things, really looking. He came to where she was. He said, "It's remarkable." She said, "It has been a good spring so far." He said, "It was a good plan, you and Oliver." She said, "It's a good garden." He looked around at the full scope of it, the established beds, the new growth, the path from the oak to the southern corner, the structured wildness that was exactly what she had intended. He said, "I haven't been in this garden in years. I'd forgotten what it could be." She said, "Oliver says you used to be in it often, when you were young." He said, "I was in it every day once. There was a summer when I think I spent more time in this garden than in the house." He paused. "My mother liked it. She was the reason it was what it was then." She said, "What was it then?" He turned and looked at her. He said, "Something like this. A bit wilder, maybe. She didn't believe in too much control." She said, "Neither does Oliver." He almost smiled, not quite, but the place just before it which she had come to know, he said she would have liked him. She said, "I think so too." They walked together slowly along the east path, not talking much, looking at things. He knew the names of some of the plants she pointed to, old knowledge, childhood knowledge, the kind that survives even when everything else changes. She knew the names Oliver had taught her and the names from the books and the names from Dr. Bright's letters. Between them they named most things in the garden, not all of them. Some things neither of them knew, and they noted those with the honest acknowledgement of two people who are comfortable being at the edge of what they know. At the north wall beds they stopped. The soil was bare there. The bulb beds were on the other side of the oak, and the white flowers had already given way to the next color as Oliver had promised. But the north wall beds were waiting. She had left them clear as Oliver had instructed. She had not planted anything in them. She had only cleared and amended the soil and let the light reach the ground. Edmund stood at the north wall and looked at the bare beds for a moment. She stood beside him. He said, "Do you think they'll come?" She said, "Oliver thinks so. He says the roots of that kind of plant are very patient." Edmund looked at the bare earth. He said, "I came out here one morning years ago and they were just there. Blue, the whole bed of them all at once. I had not seen them emerge. They were simply there." She said, "That's how it is with patient things." He turned and looked at her. She met his eyes and held them in the way that she had learned over 9 months and 12 days of living in this house, steadily, without deflection, with the full honesty that was hers. He said, "Ilara." It was the first time he had used her name since the wedding. She waited. He said, "I owe you an apology that is considerably better than the one I put in that letter. I am working on it. I am not yet there." She said, "I know." He said, "Are you?" He stopped. He started again. "Are you all right in this house, in this? Are you all right?" She thought about this question. She thought about the honest answer, the whole one, the one she would write in her journal rather than the one that was diplomatic. Then she gave him the honest one because he had asked honestly. She said, "Yes, I have made a life here that is genuinely mine. The garden is part of it. Clara is part of it, the library, the letters, the drawings. I have built something in this house that I am proud of, and it belongs to me entirely, regardless of anything else." He took this in. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the anything else?" She said, "The anything else is still being worked out." He nodded. He looked back at the north wall beds. He said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" He looked at her. He said, "I am beginning to." She accepted that. It was the honest answer. Beginning to was different from claiming he already did, and the difference mattered. She filed it in the place where she kept everything careful. They walked back along the east path together. At the garden door he held it for her. She went through. He came after her. In the entrance hall, where the current flower arrangement was the first real spring flowers Mrs. Tate had found, something yellow, something cheerful, something that meant it was actually spring now, they stopped briefly. She said, "Breakfast?" He said, "Yes." They went to breakfast together. They sat not at opposite ends of the long table but at the same end, where the morning light came from the east windows, and they had their breakfast and talked, not about anything enormous, not about the 9 months or the dinner or the letter or the garden conversation. They talked about the property matter Mr. Gregory had left unresolved, and about a letter Edmund had received from an old colleague, and about whether the spring had come early this year or whether this was the usual timing, and they had simply not been paying attention in previous years. It was, as conversations go, not a remarkable one. It was the kind of conversation that happens every morning in houses all over the country, between two people who are beginning to know each other, covering ordinary ground with the particular ease of people who are finding, with some surprise, that the ground between them is easier than they expected. Clara came in with more tea. She did not visibly react to the fact that the Duke and Duchess were having breakfast together at the same end of the table because Clara was Clara. But when she set the tea down and Alara glanced at her, Clara's face held the very smallest of expressions, too small to name, gone almost immediately. That was, Alara translated something like, yes. She held on to that. The day opened ahead of them. After breakfast, Edmund went to his study and Alara went to the morning room, and the house resumed its usual rhythm, the way a river resumes its course after a stone is moved, the same river, the same direction, but slightly altered in its passage. She sat in the morning room with her letters and her tea and thought about the morning. She thought about the north wall beds and the bare earth that might or might not be holding 22-year-old roots that might or might not decide to come back this spring. She thought about Edmund at 8 years old in the East Garden every day of a summer. She thought about a woman who had planted blue flowers on a wall because her son asked her to. She thought about all the things that had happened in this house before she arrived and all the things that had happened since. She opened her journal. She did not write immediately. She sat with the open journal and the pen and thought about what the last year had been, what it had made her into, what she was now that she had not been at the beginning. She thought about the girl in the photograph with her arms out and whether she would recognize this woman and whether this woman was recognizable as her. She thought she was. She thought they were the same person, the laughing girl in the yellow collar dress and the woman in the spring morning room. The same person, more of herself, having survived something that had tried to make her less. She wrote in the journal, "1 year ago I sat at a dinner table in September and was told who I was for. This morning I had breakfast with my husband at the bright end of the same table, and we talked about an unresolved property matter and whether spring was early this year, and both things were true at the same time, the September and the March, and both things were mine. I have not forgotten the September, I do not think I will, but the March is also real. The March is the garden and Clara and Oliver, and the letters and the drawings and the white flowers that came first, and the blue flowers that may yet come from roots that have been waiting 22 years. I do not know what the rest of this year will hold. I know what this year has held, which is more than I could have told you in September. I know what I am capable of. I know what my silence was worth. I know what I made in the months when no one was looking. I made it anyway, and it is real and it will last." He said this morning, "I am beginning to understand." I believe him. I think, and this is new, this is something I could not have said 3 months ago, I think there is something worth understanding in him too. We will say. She closed the journal. She looked at the morning room window. Through it, beyond the glass, the East Garden was fully visible in the March morning light, color arriving by the day now, the white and yellow and the first blue things at the outer edges of the beds, and somewhere in the north wall beds under the bare earth, roots that nobody had disturbed. Doing what roots do. Preparing in their own time, in their own way, to come back. She went to the garden. Oliver was there already, as he always was, moving along the beds with the patient attention of someone who has given his life to watching things grow. He looked up when she came through the door. He looked at her, and then at the garden and back at her. He said, "The north wall beds." She said, "What about them?" He said, "Come and see." She followed him along the east path past the oak to the north wall. She looked at the bare beds. They were not entirely bare. At the far left corner of the north wall, where the stone met the earth at an angle that caught the morning sun from the east, there was something, very small, very new, the particular green of something that has not yet decided what it is going to be but has decided with the full conviction of living things that it is going to be something. She stood over it. Oliver stood beside her. She said very quietly, "Is that it?" He said, "That's it." She looked at the tiny green thing in the corner of the north wall bed, existing with the uncomplicated confidence of something that had been in the ground for 22 years and had simply been waiting for the right spring. She felt the east light on her face. She felt the garden around her, the full complexity and beauty of what she and Oliver had made in 9 months, and the older, deeper complexity of what the garden had been before either of them, and what it would be after. She felt the house behind her, the stone and the history and the paintings and the library and the long dining table, and the particular silence of a house that was waking up after a long time of simply existing. She felt herself, standing in the morning light above a small green thing that had come back from its roots. She straightened up, she breathed. The air was cold and clean and smelled of earth and the beginning of things. She said to Oliver, "Blue." He said, "Blue." She nodded. She took the path back to the garden door. She went through the entrance hall where the spring flowers were in their yellow brightness. She went to the morning room. She picked up her pen. She opened the letter she had begun to her mother 3 days ago and had not yet finished. She wrote, "Something came back this morning. I'm not sure yet what it means or what it will become or how long it will take. But it came back and it is real and it is growing and I am here." She thought that was the truest thing she had ever written. She sealed the letter. She went to the library. She had, as she always did, a great deal to read. And for the first time in exactly 1 year, she was not reading alone in the way that means you have no one to tell. She was reading in the way that means you have someone who might, eventually, when the time was right and the roots were ready and the spring had done what springs do to patient ground, be interested in what you found. That was enough. It was more than enough. The garden was outside, the house was around her, the light was good. She turned the page. 3 days later, the blue flowers came. Not just in the corner anymore. The whole of the north wall bed had woken up in the way that Oliver had said it would, all at once, or what looked like all at once, though she understood now that it had been happening for weeks below the surface. The patient and invisible work of root becoming shoot, becoming leaf, becoming the deep, clear blue of Campanula latifolia in full spring. She saw them first in the morning from the east window of the library, which had a partial view of the north wall if you stood at a certain angle. She was not standing there intentionally. She was returning a book to the shelf, and she glanced through the window in the way she always glanced through windows in this house, habitually, with genuine attention, and she saw the blue. She stood very still for a moment. Then she set the book on the nearest surface and went out to the garden. Oliver was not there yet. She stood at the north wall alone and looked at the blue flowers in the morning light, and the flowers were everything he had described, and everything she had hoped, and something more than both. They had a quality she had not anticipated, a brightness that was not showy but true, a blue that was the particular color of things that have survived rather than things that were always easy. She stood there for a long time. The sun came up behind the east wall and the light changed and the blue changed with it, and she watched all of it. She heard the garden door open behind her. She expected Oliver. She did not turn around immediately. She heard Edmund's steps on the stone path. She turned. He was coming along the east path in his morning coat, walking with the usual straightness, the usual certainty of his way of moving through the world. He looked at the garden as he walked. He looked at the things that had come up, the color in the beds, the structure of the paths. He was taking it in properly. She could see that from across the garden. He came to the north wall. He stopped beside her. He looked at the blue flowers. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that was lower than his usual voice, and had something in it that she recognized, not because she had heard it from him before, but because she had heard it in herself on the morning she stood in the morning room, and understood that the conversation she thought had stopped had in fact been going on everywhere around her. He said, "There they are." She said, "Yes." He stood beside her above his mother's flowers for a long time. She stood beside him. The morning moved around them. The light shifted. The blue flowers held their color through the changing light with the steady assurance of things that have been this color for a long time and have every intention of continuing. Edmund said, "She would have been glad of you." She did not answer immediately. She let the sentence settle. Then she said, "I would have liked to know her." He said, "Yes." He paused. "I think she would have given you the garden, actually. She was like that. She gave things to people who would use them properly." She said, "I will use it properly." He said, "I know." The morning continued. They stood a little longer above the flowers and then, without discussion, without deciding to, began to walk back along the east path together. They walked slowly. They talked about what had come up in the other beds, about Oliver's plans for the south corner, about a question she had asked Dr. Bright that she had not yet received an answer to. They talked about small things, ordinary things, the things that a person talks about on a morning walk through a garden with someone they are beginning to know. At the garden door he held it, she went through, he followed. In the entrance hall, the spring flowers were doing their usual cheerful work. She looked at them and thought of the first winter flowers, the ones he had placed there back in November that she had walked past every day without commenting, and she felt the distance between that November and this March as a real and substantial thing, not like time that has merely passed, but like time that has been used. She turned to him, she said, "Edmund." He looked at her. She said, "Thank you for the flowers, the ones in November. And all the ones since." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not into any expression she had seen from him, but into something new, something she did not yet have a name for and would spend the months ahead learning. He said, "You knew." She said, "I live in this house, I notice things." He said, "Yes, and then, I am beginning to understand that." She said, "Good." She went upstairs. She went to her writing desk. She sat down, she opened the journal. She had written a great deal in this journal, 12 months of evenings, 12 months of honesty, 12 months of the particular voice she reserved for the things she could not yet say to anyone. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "The flowers came back." She wrote, "We stood above them together." She wrote, "He said his mother would have given me the garden. I believe this is the most personal thing he has ever said to me." She looked at those 3 sentences for a while. Then she wrote, "I have been in this house for 1 year. I arrived not knowing what I was walking into. I built something inside it that is mine and will last. I found my ground and stood on it. I was silent when silence was the right thing, and I spoke when speaking was the right thing, and I made those decisions myself on my own terms in my own time." She wrote, "I do not know what comes next. I am not worried about what comes next. What comes next has roots." She closed the journal. She held it in both hands for a moment, this green journal she had bought in the town she grew up in, with her initials pressed into the front cover in gold. It was nearly full. She would need a new one soon. She noted this without sadness. The beginning of a new journal was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new page. She put the journal down. She looked at the east window. The garden was visible, fully, the whole of it in the spring morning light, the color and the structure and the paths that had been laid stone by stone over these months, and the north wall where the blue flowers were. Exactly what they had been planted to become. She was exactly what she had decided to become. This was not the end of the story, and she knew it. The story she was in was long and had no final chapter yet, and would ask more of her than it had asked and would give more than it had given. The man she was married to was still becoming someone she understood, and that understanding would take time she was prepared to give, and it would also require from him the ongoing willingness to be known that the blue flowers and the December letter and the November flowers had been, she thought, the beginning of. She did not know how the middle would go, she knew the beginning. She had lived it every day of it with full attention and full honesty and the particular kind of persistence that her father had called character. Once, in a conversation she had never forgotten, not the big dramatic things he had said, but the ordinary daily choosing of who you are. She had chosen every day who she was. She was glad of who she had chosen. She went down to the garden. Oliver was there now, checking the north wall beds with the close attention of someone confirming what he had expected. He looked up when she came through the door. She said, "They're beautiful." He said, "They were always going to be." She said, "Yes." She walked the east path. She touched one of the silver plants that she had put in last autumn, well established now, its roots the deepest in the garden. She looked at the white flowers that had come first and were still going, still small and steady and entirely themselves. She looked at the new things that were only just arriving, the things she had not yet had time to learn properly. She had a great deal still to learn. She thought that was probably the most honest and best thing she could say about any of it. She went to the north wall. The blue flowers were there as they had been, as they intended to be. She stood above them in the spring light. The light was good. The air was cold and clean. The garden was awake. She was awake. The story was not finished. But the first part of it, the hardest part, the part she had carried alone in the quiet of 12 months and made into something she was proud of, that part was done. She looked at the blue. She stayed there a while. Then she went inside and made herself useful and lived her day, as she had lived every day of the year that had just passed, fully, clearly as herself, with the complete and unshakable knowledge of who she was. Which was, it turned out, quite enough. More than quite enough. Everything she needed.